Urim and Thummim was specifically designed for the translation.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in my view, the whole narrative collapses if you say, well, he could just use a Seer Stone. Because
Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And I'm really excited for today's episode. I'm going to be doing an interview with Jonathon Neville and James or Jim Lucas. Welcome, guys.
hi, happy to be
Hello.
here.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. And we're going to be discussing their book by means of the Urim and Thummim. So we're going to be discussing their view of the translation of the Book of Mormon, both the mechanics of the translation. Was it the Urim and Thummim or the Nephite interpreters or spectacles, as Oliver and Joseph would claim in their statements, or was it a Seer Stone, as many other witnesses claim? And then we're also going to touch on their view of the nature of the translation, because that was one part of your book. I think there was at least 2, maybe 3 chapters on like the nature of the translation. You know, was he reading it word for word, or was he involved as a translator? Was it more of a functional translation and taking into account like King James Bible passages or Protestant Methodist sounding, phraseology in the Book of Mormon? So we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So I'm hoping that this will be a good episode. And I think your book is important, that it's challenging the narrative that we have, that it was the Urim and Thummim, but mostly the Seer Stone. I actually thought it was quite a good intellectual case that you made trying to defend the Urim and Thummim, because a lot of people can be quite dismissive, particularly of the work of, like the Stoddards, who try to deny the Seer Stone accounts, and because they associate the Seer Stone with like the occult, and they're driven by, there's no way that Joseph could have used a Seer Stone because of the implications. I think your approach was a little bit different, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Could you maybe, Jonathon, first introduce yourself in 1 minute, just explain who you are, your background relationship with the church, and anything else about your, work in apologetics or scholarship?
Okay, sure. Yeah, my name's Jonathon Neville. I live in Oregon. I've lived all over the world, actually, and in different, China, Africa, Europe. And so I've had a lot of exposure. I grew up in kind of a mixed faith family. My parents were divorced. My father was LDS, my mother wasn't, and my father was inactive most of the time when we were kids. And then when they each remarried people of their respective faiths. So I had a LDS family I grew up in part of the time, and a non-LDS family I grew up part of the time. So for me, I've looked at this my whole life as kind of from an objective standpoint more.
Right, you got to see the both sides, both perspectives.
Yeah, exactly. And so Mormonism wasn't something that I just accepted on its face. It wasn't in my environment when I grew up, in other words. So, people say they're a convert or not a convert. I guess I was kind of in between. So I was baptized when I was 9 years old, for example. And so I never really got into apologetics until about 10 years ago. When I went to BYU, and I was a total fan of Farms, Jack Welch's organization,
Yeah.
which kind of progressed and morphed into Book of Mormon Central and the Interpreter and Fair LDS, Fair Mormon, which is now Fair LDS. And I really liked those guys. I thought they were fantastic. And then it was probably about 10 years ago when I was writing a novel about Native Americans, and someone introduced me to Rod Meldrum, said I needed to talk to Rod Meldrum, and it was a mutual friend. And I did, and I talked to him, and he said, oh, you need to come on a tour. And I'd never really been to Ohio. I've been all around the world, but not Ohio. And so I thought, all right, I'll go on the tour to Ohio. And one thing led to another. I asked him, well, why did we ever get this Mesoamerican thing? And he said it was because of these articles in the Times and Seasons. And that's really where I started doing my own independent research instead of just deferring to the scholars. I started looking into who was responsible for these articles in the Times and Seasons. And that was the first book. I thought it'd be the only book I ever did. But additional issues kept surfacing to the point now I think I've got 10 books out on church history on specific topics, as well as the Book of Mormon setting. So that's my background.
Well, very good. And we talked about off air that you would hold to the Heartland geography model for the Book of Mormon, and you've done an episode responding to or analyzing an interview episode I did with Brent Gardner on like Mesoamerican convergences, and we did an episode him critiquing the Heartland. So I'll have to bring you back on because I need to be fair and balanced. So I need to talk to people who have different views and bring you on, and you can sort of give your case for Heartland and your analysis or critique of Mesoamerican, and then respond to maybe some of the criticisms leveled against your theory. That could be quite fun.
Yeah, totally. And I should emphasize too that my overall approach is multiple working hypotheses, where I'm fine with people believing whatever they want. The only thing that I resist is when people don't address all the evidence.
Yes.
And so, and I think you're sympathetic with that as well. And so I
Mm-hmm.
feel like, you know, Jim and I are both lawyers, and we know that in any kind of trial, if you only hear one side, it's persuasive, right? It's when you hear the two sides and you look at all the evidence, then I've developed this thing called the faith model, where you start with the facts. Everybody can agree what the facts are, but then you overlay that with assumptions, inferences, and theories to reach a hypothesis. And it uses faith as an acronym. And when you do that, it's real easy to see where views diverge. It's not because of the facts are different, it's because of the assumptions and inferences. And that's what I love doing. I love teasing out those assumptions and inferences so everybody is clear on exactly what people are saying.
Yeah, I'm all for that, you know, trying to be transparent to present both sides and all of the data. You know, if you're going to be objective, you need to share all of it. You need to be open to hearing different viewpoints and their challenges against your view, and that can also be helpful. It can be annoying if you have a certain view and then there's new information that challenges it, but hey, we're ever learning. Jim.
Well, and hopefully we're flexible. I'll do one last thing, because I believed in the Mesoamerican stuff for decades. So I have completely changed my perspective on that. So I feel like that's lends an air of, or an indication of open-mindedness at least. So,
and I think that's important, because I feel that there can be a lot of polarizations. Now, for me, at the moment where I'm at, I would lean more with Mesoamerica, but I don't overly care if somebody, you know, holds a different geographical model. I'm not going to see them as an enemy. I know you could discuss it, you could challenge their view and want to understand it, but there can be a lot of polarization to people who disagree, which I find funny if you're both sort of believers in, you know, the foundational truth claims. You know, we should be fighting more with the critics. So yeah, hopefully there'll be a little bit less of that as well.
Yeah,
because we got to get used to it.
Well, I have a website called nomorecontention.com, and in there I try to lay this all out, where I say, look, let's just look at everything. There's no reason to contend about it. The contention arises from feeling a compulsion to persuade or convert somebody, whereas if your objective is just to understand one another, you don't have contention. So that's the direction I'm moving more and more in.
Yeah, I agree with that. I feel we can have these tough conversations. We can ask questions. We can challenge each other, but there's a difference between, you know, discussing or even disagreeing and then being, you know, contentious about it.
Right.
I'm not really for that. Jim, sorry, we just let you just sitting there. Briefly introduce yourself. Tell us a little about your background and how you got into sort of, you know, writing books as well.
Well, I'm my background ethnically is Utah Mormon. I come from pioneer ancestry and so forth. Was born in Utah and so forth. However, when I was still quite young, my family moved to New York for my father's work. And so, aside from being on a mission and going to BYU for bachelor's degree, I spent all my life in New York, in the New York area, as a child in the New York suburbs and as an adult in the New York City. So while there, I kind of lived between two worlds in a different way than Jonathon, but still, I very much had that experience of living in two worlds. At home and at church, I was in one world, and at school and with my friends, I was in another world. The community I grew up in was very mixed, heavily Jewish. You know, those were my friends, the people I hung out with. So I kind of, you know, had again this experience of seeing two worlds and negotiating between two worlds. as I'm an attorney, also went to Columbia Law School, practiced law in New York City for many, many years. My first interest in LDS history came when I became interested in the subject of the United Order and the ideas of the law of consecration and the economic aspects of the gospel. So I researched that, and in the late 1990s, I co-authored a book with Warner Woodworth called "Working Towards Zion: Principles of the United Order for the Modern World." And so we kind of, it's a too long book because it basically is two books in one. It's my book and Warner's book, and so but we kind of explored both the history of it and also tried to explore applications in our current society, not in some idealized society, but actually the current society we live in, from the individual level to the macroeconomic level.
Right.
And then I also was involved in researching the history of the church in New York City. I participated in a group led by Claudia and Richard Bushman that studied the history of Latter-day Saints in New York City, and we published a book kind of all jointly on that. And then only in the last few years, now Jonathon and I have known each other for a very long time. My family lived in Phoenix, Arizona for a while, where he lived for a period of time in his life. So we kind of crossed paths there, and we shared a lot of interests and would send each other our writings on various subjects to critique. But it's only in the last few years that I started to read his, at that time, only recently for him also, church history studies, and became particularly intrigued by the issue of the translation of the Book of Mormon. And so I suggested to him that we should advance his work on that particular subject that he had already started. He wrote a book called A Man That Can Translate. And so I suggested that we move that research forward and maybe make it a slightly more condensed version of the book. Jonathon's extremely thorough. He footnotes everything. He covers everything. So I was the guy who said, "Well, okay, let's have a little bit shorter version of this," but also advancing the research considerably. So he agreed, and when we got into this project, at first we were just going to kind of do a shorter version of the work that he'd done. But as we both got into the research, we discovered so much more stuff and so much more material that we realized we really had an independent volume that really advanced to considerably more stuff. So in the course of that, just in the last year, I moved to Salt Lake City just to be able to pursue this better and have access to some other things. And the book is now out, and we're on Mormonism with the Murph.
Yeah, and you've been on a few other channels. You were on Stephen Pineker's YouTube channel, Mormon Book Reviews. You're a common guest on there, Jonathon Hadley, and you sort of discussed this. I believe you were on Gospel Tangents as well. Unfortunately, I didn't get the opportunity because I've had friends up this week and I've not had the opportunity to listen to your episodes. So you might be going over those discussions. But yeah, this is the book by means of the Urim and Thummim. And like you were saying, it was about, I think, 200 pages roughly, which, I don't mind a good long book, but sometimes it's nice when you have a shorter book. But there's a lot in it as well. It's an easy and it's quite an enjoyable read as well. So my first question is, Jonathon,
I have to ask you one quick question.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Is the version that you got the one that also has the illustrations?
I think it does. Yeah. Let me just double check. They weren't in color, but like black and white ones, I think.
Yes.
Okay.
Although I'm going through it and I actually can't see any. Oh, yes. Like, for example, here.
Right.
Yeah. So there's some.
So it also has, not only is it just 200 pages long, but also has pictures.
Also has pictures. Makes it even better.
Yes.
I always loved picture books growing up. They're my favorite books. Okay. So first question I want to ask is, so the motivations for writing this book. So you say that you read some of Jonathon's work beforehand and you sort of wanted to collaborate with him. When did you start sort of challenging the Seer Stone in the hat, or the Sith narrative, as you refer to it in the book. I just think of Star Wars when you say that. Was that after the church's gospel topics essay, when the church sort of announced that Joseph Smith had a Seer Stone and said that the Seer Stone was being used in the translation? Was it around that time where you sort of researched and wanted to challenge this, or did you before that even reject the Seer Stone? Like, what sort of triggered this?
You know, that's a good point. I have a book, I don't know if I have it handy, called Whatever Happened to the Golden Plates. It's this one. And this one came out, boy, it's 7 or 8 years ago. And in this book, the first edition, I actually said that Joseph used the Urim and Thummim in Harmony and the Seer Stone in Fayette. So I was a Seer Stone person even as recently as 5 or 6 years ago. And the feedback I got on this is a book that talks about the 2 different sets of plates, the abridged plates.
And when did you write that book?
I think it was in 2017. I'd have to look again. 2016.
Sorry, guys, can you hear me? Because it says my mic is disconnected.
I hear you fine.
I can hear you.
Yeah?
So,
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Sorry,
So this is in 2016, I wrote this book. And the gist of this book was that Joseph didn't have the plates of Nephi until he got to Fayette. That's because they were in the repository in Cumorah, which is ancillary to what we're talking about today. But that was the gist of the book. But in there, I talked just briefly about the translation. And I said, Joseph used the Urim and Thummim in Harmony when he gave the plates to the messenger, the abridged plates, to the messenger who took them back to Cumorah. He also gave him the Urim and Thummim. And so when he got to Fayette, all he had was the Seer Stone. That's what I believed at the time, because that's what everybody was saying, the Gospel Topics essay.
And there's some accounts which we can talk about later, like Emma Smith, Whitmer, Martin Harris. They sort of support that it was the Urim and Thummim for the 116 pages, and then after that it was just the Seer Stone. That was your view and assumption as well?
Well, I assume, because it's in the Gospel Topics essay, everybody said that. And as I started getting feedback on this book, readers would write to me and say, no, he only used the Urim and Thummim, he never used a Seer Stone. So that led me to delve into that topic more. And the more I delved into it, the more I realized that, well, I guess we're going to get to that here in a minute, but I changed my mind, basically. I'm open-minded enough to say, okay, I was wrong when I wrote that, because here's additional evidence that indicates, or persuades me anyway, that Joseph Smith translated the entire Book of Mormon with the Urim and Thummim and the plates, but he also used the Seer Stone. And the explanation that I've come up with since then in this process is that Joseph used the Seer Stone only for a demonstration, not for an actual translation.
Right.
So, and a lot of my critics say, well, you are just trying to prove he never used the Urim, or that he never used the Seer Stone, which is not accurate, because as I pointed out, initially I published that he did use the Seer Stone. And then even today, I'm saying he did use a Seer Stone, just not for the translation.
Yeah, because I alluded to it at the start, because I'm only really have been aware of the work of, for example, the Stoddards, who would deny the Seer Stone accounts, but they seem to come from the position of, the Seer Stones and engaging in magic. That's all the occult. So that would be really problematic if Joseph Smith used a Seer Stone in his youth, and then so he couldn't have, if he used the same Seer Stone and translating the Book of Mormon, that's problematic. And you're not coming from it from that same view, because you acknowledge in his youth that yes, he had a Seer Stone, he was involved in treasure digging, but you're challenging the accounts themselves that support a Seer Stone being used, not because you find it necessarily problematic, because he's using the same object they used in, like, say, the occult. You're not coming from that angle, but you're more saying that you don't find those statements as reliable as Joseph and Oliver.
Yes and no. Let me try to get the nuance here.
First, Johnson, just hold up your stack just so you can quickly see.
So Jim wanted me to. I have a stack of some. These aren't all my books, but these are my books on church history and.
Cool.
Geography. So there's a lot of them in here.
Oh, very good.
Okay.
I had a stack.
Everyone buy those books.
Well, and since you mentioned illustrated books, I have this book too, this illustrated book. I don't know if you've seen this.
Lemurs, chameleons, and the golden plates. What on earth is that about?
Well, it's an African perspective on the restoration. And I
Okay.
wrote this I have an African friend. He lives he's from Madagascar, but he lives in Mauritius. I lived in Mauritius for a while. And so he's relating the story of the gospel from this African perspective. His grandparents talking to their kids about the restoration. But so he intermingles African culture with LDS culture, shows how temples are consistent with their traditional beliefs about family and so on. But in there, I also talk about church history. So I guess the nuance I'd like to say on the Seer Stone is that I think Joseph Smith used it as a kind of an aid to faith for his supporters, because they were all familiar with seer stones. They believed they worked. And it's kind of similar to when in the Bible, when the woman touched Jesus's gown to be healed, the gown didn't heal her, but it was an aid to her faith. And there's other examples in church history where I think Wilford Woodruff took Joseph's handkerchief to help heal people because it aided their faith, right? And if I remember right, it was even Hiram Smith who wanted Joseph to give a revelation, but he wanted him to get it through the Seer Stone, not just to dictate it.
Right.
So for some reason, the early saints felt like if it came through the Seer Stone, it was more credible or more divine than if Joseph just related it. But I don't think Joseph Smith needed the Seer Stone at all. I don't think.
Well, didn't he later say that he no longer needed the stone, that he was able to channel the revelation himself? It was just sort of an aid. I know David Whitmer had an issue with that.
Yeah, well, I think the quote you're talking about is when he gave the Seer Stone to Oliver Cowdery. He said he didn't need it any longer.
Yeah, that's one.
And people have inferred from that. This is an example of the inferences that people make. People inferred that meant he didn't need to translate with it anymore. I'm saying he didn't need it to do demonstrations anymore.
Right. Okay.
So he didn't need it anymore. So that's an example. There's a fact, and there's different inferences you can draw from it.
Okay. So getting back to the question, so you're not coming from this from the same angle as the Stoddards?
No. I mean, I'm sympathetic with some of the things they say because they do have some good history in their book, but they also omit evidence that contradicts their theory. So
which isn't good.
No, it does. I disagree with them on some of the points and agree with them on others, like with everyone else's theory. I mean, I agree with Brent Gardner on a lot of things too, and disagree with him on others. Yeah. So this part of this multiple working hypotheses that we talked about.
Okay, very good. But so let's start off with I want you to talk about your case or the argument you make why you believe it was just the Urim and Thummim or the spectacles. And maybe you could talk about what Joseph and Oliver had to say about the translation of the Book of Mormon.
Okay, Jim, do you want to do that part?
Yeah, I'll do the brief. I'll try to do the brief briefly.
And all the statements are in the book, and I did read through a lot of them. I think you also made the argument that you feel that maybe some of the gospel topics essays or other historians de-emphasize Joseph and Oliver's statements.
Yeah.
Yes, very much. So let's just take it chronologically. So you have the late 1820s, Joseph has received the plates. He's received the interpreters, which at some point started to be called the Urim and Thummim. If you follow the Joseph Smith history in the Pearl of Great Price, it was Moroni who used that term. If you're looking external sources, Jonathon found a newspaper article from Boston in 1832.
Well, let me just stop. I didn't find it. Someone else found it, but I found it. Someone else
found it to you.
Okay.
But anyway, we have a newspaper article from Boston in 1832 where it reports Orson Hyde and Samuel Smith preaching and using the term Urim and Thummim to describe the means by which the Book of Mormon is translated. So the term comes into use very early to refer to the interpreters.
You said that was 1832? Because I've heard some scholars like Brant Gardner or Dan Vogel, when I've asked them about it, they would say that the term Urim and Thummim didn't come from Joseph Smith, but either Oliver Cowdery or W.W. Phelps, and that was later sort of adopted, that term for the interpreters.
Well, the traditional view was that the earliest source that the historians were aware of was an 1833 article by W. Phelps.
That was it. Yeah.
But as I indicate, just said, okay, another source supplied us with a reference to an 1832 Boston newspaper account in which, as said, Arson Hyde and Samuel Smith are using the term, and they're not saying, "Oh, this is a new term or what we call it." They just are using the term Urim and Thummim like that was what they were used to hearing, which one can imply from that, one can infer from that. You have to try to be clear about the facts versus the inferences. That this was a term that was already in use in Kirtland even earlier than that, because where else would Samuel Smith and Orson Hyde have heard of it before they went on this missionary trip to Boston? So in any event, there are newspaper accounts even earlier than that, 1829, a couple of them that refer to the spectacles, or there's also early accounts that use the term two stones. So Joseph used the spectacles or two stones. They also mention the hat, to be fair.
Is that Jonathon Hadley? I think he was one, wasn't he?
Right, the Palmyra Freeman, and I can't remember the other one was. But anyway, so those are almost certainly secondhand accounts, but they're very early. And then you have, as I said, 1832 already. We have two kind of central missionaries, and Samuel Smith, Orson Hyde were pretty central figures in the early Restoration, already using the term like that was the term that these things are called in their missionary teaching. But we do have in 1831, there is an account where Hiram asked Joseph to speak to the elders about how the Book of Mormon came forth. And he made this kind of general statement that the Book of Mormon was not yet to be revealed.
Yeah, it's not expedient for the world to know all the particulars. It was just the given power of God.
Right.
Not very helpful, Joseph. Come on.
But here now we continue the story. So we see the use of the term Urim and Thummim to refer to the interpreters, and it's clear that a lot of people know that these spectacle-like objects came with the plates. People have been told this, and so this seems to be general knowledge amongst early church members. Then in 1834, it all changes, so to speak, because a book was published called Mormonism Unveiled. And Mormonism Unveiled, I mean, it's very significant in history, even though, you can say, well, it's trash because, it's just anti-Mormon and biased and so forth. But nonetheless, it is the first full-length book on Mormonism, and it's the first major anti-Mormon work on Mormonism. So it's a significant historical document. And in Eberhau's Mormonism Unveiled in 1834, he presents three theories as to where the Book of Mormon came from. One, he reports the stories about the spectacles, the magic spectacles. I don't know if he uses the term Urim and Thummim or not.
He does. Yeah, he does.
He does use Urim and Thummim to refer to the two stones, the magic spectacles. So he gives that account. Then he gives the stone in the hat account as a distinctive, separate explanation. And he doesn't give, unfortunately, in that part of the book, he doesn't give sources. Other parts of the book contain the Hurlburt affidavits. So there's, it's not that he didn't know how to get sources, but he doesn't give.
So he doesn't attribute those statements to anyone in particular, right. But he's obviously heard them from someone.
That. That's right. It said that, or so forth. So he gives the account of the spectacles. Then he gives the stone in the hat account, where Joseph had a peep stone. He called it a peep stone, and he put it in his hat. So that is fully explained as an alternative, separate explanation for how the Book of Mormon is translated. And then, of course, very significantly, this is the first place the Spalding theories put forth. So as a third explanation for the Book of Mormon, he puts forth the explanation that it came from a romance by Solomon Spalding that Sidney Rigdon had doctored up to make more religious. So those are the three major theories. They're all fully presented in Mormonism Unveiled. And that kind of changes the environment. Joseph, of course, immediately denounced Mormonism Veiled as, a pack of lies and completely inaccurate and so forth. But it was out there and these theories started to spread. So beginning in right after Mormonism Unveils appears, Joseph and Oliver realize apparently that they need to put out their side of the story. So this 1831 reticence of Joseph's is over, and Oliver begins a series of letters, which constitute effectively the first official church history. They're in the form of letters to the editor of the Evening Morning Star, but there's 8 of them, and he basically goes over the history of the church up to that point. And he's using Joseph as a source. He refers to using his notes and consulting with President Smith and so forth. So, Joseph is clearly involved and approves of this because he has these letters republished several times. And in the letter number 1, the very first one, Oliver, specifically refutes. I don't think he doesn't specifically mention Mormonism Veiled, but he clearly specifically states, and this is the quote, that famous quote, those were days never to be forgotten, that appears as a footnote in the current Pearl of Great Price. But if you read the full quote, he says, those were days as I, received, by the gift and power of God, the dictation, by what means of the Urim and Thummim, which the Nephites would call the interpreters. So already in that very first one, Oliver is making it very clear that it's these interpreters that came with the plates that have become to be called the Urim and Thummim that were used for the translation. And then what follows over the course of the remainder of the 1830s and through the 1840s is both Joseph and Oliver make repeated statements in writing to the effect that the means of translation of the Book of Mormon was the Urim and Thummim, and they're almost always very clear to indicate that what they're referring to is the interpreters that came with the plates. They make that very, very clear. So it's hard not to see that as them explicitly refuting the alternative accounts that Mormonism Unveiled had presented, which is the stone in the hat and the Spalding theory. So Joseph is presenting these accounts. We have them from Joseph right up through 1842 in the famous Wentworth letter, where he's very clear that it's the Urim and Thummim that came with the plates that were used. Oliver also, when he does his famous speech, when he returns to the church in 1848, he repeats it very specifically. I was the one who wrote the Book of Mormon, not Solomon Spalding. I wrote it, on the dictation of God as it came from the, what the Nephites would have referred to as the interpreters. They're very explicit, very clear, both of them. There's, you saw there's an appendix in our book that lists all of these accounts, almost a dozen.
Yeah, I think I read them all.
Joseph.
So they're consistent, and they both reaffirm in the late 1830s, early 1840s. You say Oliver as well, when he comes back to the church, that it was by means of the Urim and Thummim, which were the Nephite interpreters or the spectacles.
Exactly. Okay, so that was, now of course the Mormonism Unveiled view of things got wide circulation because, of course, non-believers, had to have some explanation, and that was a very, it's a full-length book and seemed to have lots of sources in it, so it had a lot of credibility. The Spalding theory got more traction than the stone in the hat theory of the two other alternatives that Heber Howe had presented, but nonetheless, it got out. But amongst members of the church or followers of the Restoration, as things began to break up a little bit after Joseph's death, the Joseph and Oliver accounts were repeated. They were well known, and that was the theory that most believing Latter-day Saints, Book of Mormon believers would adhere to. then leap forward to the 1870s. So, of course, by now, Brighamites have gone off to Utah. The reorganization has occurred. Other groups, there was the whole episode with the Strang, and lots of other, restoration groups had come and gone. Rigdon had gone off to Pittsburgh and was ultimately going to be found a group that would ultimately morph into what we now call the Bickertonites, the Church of Jesus Christ. So, this scattering had occurred, but still, so we have two characters who had become rather quiet. One was William McClellan, who was an original member of the Quorum of the 12, and the other was David Whitmer, both of whom had basically kind of gone to ground during the 1850s, 1860s. They just were, they'd done some preaching, they were around, but they didn't really surface much. And then in the 1870s, but they broke with, they did not only did they not follow Brigham Young, but they denounced Joseph Smith as a fallen prophet. So, that was their view, but they weren't really super active in preaching it. Then William McClellan got kind of activated, and he went around. And so basically, part of their story as to why Joseph Smith was a fallen prophet was the Stone in the Hat account. They revived the Stone in the Hat account, and they went around and started talking to everybody, and William McClellan tried to collect affidavits from people. This is where the Elizabeth Cowdery affidavit comes from, that's torn in half, and Jonathon mentioned it briefly. We may get into these specifics. Sure. And so he went around. He visited with Emma Smith. He visited with Joseph Smith III. He visited lots of people. And part of his his push was Joseph was a fallen prophet, and and then David Whitmer kind of picked this up a little bit later in the 1860s, but more the 1870s. In the 1870s, and then really going strong in the 1880s. David Whitmer also starts to pick up the same theme. Joseph was a fallen prophet after the Book of Mormon came out. And part of this argument, and it's more clearly made in David Whitmer's writings than in McClellan's, is the argument that after Joseph was already starting to fall, even when he was translating the Book of Mormon. They both were strong Book of Mormon believers right to the end. But after, even as he was translating the Book of Mormon, he was transgressing. So David Whitmer's characterization of the Lost Pages episode is that now we know that, the Lord was unhappy, and he did rebuke Joseph for, he's pestering him to let Martin take the pages. But in David Whitmer's retelling, this was grave transgression. This was a sign of Joseph already starting to become a transgressor. And one of the symbols of this transgression was that the messenger took away the plates of the interpreters and never gave them back. And that's why Joseph had to turn to the Seer Stone to finish the translation of the Book of Mormon we have today. And that was sort of the story, and it tied into David and McClellan's, but especially David's whole theory argument that Joseph, was a fallen prophet from the, once the Book of Mormon was out, Joseph was a fallen prophet after that. And he was on his way into fall, even while he was translating the Book of Mormon, because he committed translation. And so the Lord took back the interpreters. So
are you saying that you would view the statements from David Whitmer and William McClellan that he became a fallen prophet, or was heading that way, after the loss of the 116 pages and the interpreters being taken away, even though I believe in the timeline that's before the three witnesses saw the angel and saw the plates in, I think it was June of 1829. But you're saying from his statements, that's when he's starting to view Joseph Smith heading that way?
That's right. So David Whitmer,
Right.
I mean, he's an interesting character
Well,
because,
just a sec, just
yeah,
to clarify that, this David Whitmer didn't think Joseph was a fallen prophet until after he left the church. So
right,
in Kirtland, he was still supporting Joseph Smith and all that. It
right.
wasn't until later, looking back on it, that he came up with this interpretation.
That's where it started. Yeah, because my understanding was he
Right.
had more of an issue with like the priesthood restoration and maybe like changes to revelations, and that was my understanding. Maybe other things as well.
Yeah,
Well,
but that was all looking back retroactively, though.
Right.
yeah. I'm now in the 1880s. I'm now with David Whitmer in the 1880s in describing this stuff. And you're quite right. So he did have the three witnesses experience, but he was still an active member of the church at that time. But looking back at it 40 years later, he's kind of remembering the events differently. And it's important to point out here that remember that what is about 75%, 74%, I think it is, of the Book of Mormon that we have today was translated in harmony. And David Whitmer was nowhere around when that happened. He then came to Harmony, picked up Joseph and Oliver, and took them up to Fayette, to his family's home, where the what's now First Nephite through Omni was translated. But even then, he was not a scribe, he was not a witness, he was not a participant. He was around because it was in his family's home, but Joseph and Oliver were upstairs doing their translation. So David Whitmer was except for probably this one demonstration that Joseph did to try to satisfy what Zenas Gurley called the awful curiosity of his supporters. There's no clear evidence that David Whitmer ever saw anything until he had the angelic manifestation that made him one of the three witnesses, which he affirmed throughout his entire life.
Right.
But after having decided that, so he was always a strong Book of Mormon guy right up to the day of his death.
Oh yeah.
David Whitmer is always strong on the Book of Mormon, but he by the 1880s, when he's in his 80s, he's starting to really, he's already been, it's decades since his break with Joseph Smith. He's starting to reinterpret things and to try to make a scenario which would explain how this why he's justified in accepting the Book of Mormon but rejecting everything else that Joseph did. And that's where his advocacy of the stone in the hat starts to come into play as a piece of that story. So we get, of course, David Whitmer being the longest surviving of the three witnesses and being located in Missouri, relatively accessible to Eastern and Midwestern newspapers. He puts this out. He has tons of interviews. There's tons of documents from him. He
Yeah.
then, at the very end of his life, writes his own book and lays all this stuff out in his own book. His book, An Address to All Believers in Christ, it's an odd book because you look at the first few pages where he reiterates his testimony as one of the three witnesses, and it's all very inspiring and great. But my comment to people is, but you've got to turn the page. And when you turn the page, the entire rest of the book, including the Stone in the Hat account, is his fierce denunciation of Joseph Smith as a fallen prophet. So, all right. So
Okay.
I'm near the end. Near the end.
All right. Go for it.
So you have by the late 1800s, some Stone in the Hat accounts floating around because David Whitmer put them out so much. But the majority of believers in all branches of the Restoration, and we'll get into this maybe when we get into Emma Smith, which includes the Reorganized Church as well as the LDS Church in Utah, accepts the Joseph and Oliver explanations that it was the Nephite interpreters that were the means of translation. And that is basically, but there will be occasionally people like B.H. Roberts who will note, hey, there's these Seer Stone accounts too. What about them? But
Right.
they don't make a big deal of it, or it doesn't become prominent.
Because
and
a question I want to bring up as well, because a lot of people
Yeah.
believe that the church hid the Seer Stone and hid the Seer Stone accounts, and it was kind of like, they're covering up the history. And I think the argument you're making is that was the traditional or the prominent narrative, that it was by means of the Urim and Thummim. And my understanding is, looking at some of the statements of people like Joseph Fielding Smith, that they sort of saw some of those statements as not reliable or erroneous and dismissed them, not in a way to intentionally cover up, but they held to the traditional narrative of Joseph and Oliver were claiming by means of the Urim and Thummim.
Absolutely. So there are, the Stone in the Hat supporters have dug out, doing very excellent, thorough research, half a dozen or more times over the course of 150 years, where there are LDS church sources that mention the Stone in the Hat, and they say, "Hey, look!"
So the church has now embraced all of those other accounts and now acknowledges, a Seer Stone being used, but it wasn't that it was necessarily intentional that they were trying to deny all those accounts as a way to hide it, but they just didn't see them as credible. That's
right. So the point of view of a Sunday school manual writer or an LDS gospel writer from the period of basically the 1800s through the early, the end of the 20th century, would be, why spend a lot of space talking about this Seer Stone when we believe Joseph and Oliver's Urim and Thummim account? So it wasn't intentionally hiding it. It was just saying, we believe Joseph, that should be what we emphasize, is what Joseph and Oliver said. There's no, and so
let me say something about that. I know they say the church was hiding it, but that's like saying you're hiding that the sky is blue. I mean, these accounts were published. Everyone knew about them. There was nothing really to hide. They weren't official church accounts. They were David Whitmer's. I have this book of David Whitmer's interviews that was published, that anybody could have access to.
Is that the Linden Cook one?
Yeah, the Linden Cook one. And almost all of them, there's only 3 that precede 1880. And that tells you all these other accounts that people are quoting are from 1880 on. But the point is that the church wasn't hiding anything. They didn't have anything to say about it, because there was no legitimate church history from their view that talked about the Stone in the Hat.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's an important point to make. Now, so before we talk about the statements of some of the witnesses that support the Seer Stone in the Hat, you did talk about this in your book, but for our listeners, could you talk about your view of the mechanics of the translation? So if you believe it was just the Urim and Thummim, what was the mechanics of the translation? Was there a curtain? Were the gold plates out in front of him? Was he wearing the breastplate? Like, what's your view of how he used the Urim and Thummim to translate the Book of Mormon, without getting into the nature of the translation, the functional? We'll talk about that later.
Okay. Well, our view is that it's hard to say, because there are different accounts. So clearly, sometimes he used a curtain. He used a curtain almost assuredly with Martin Harris, because Martin Harris, there's lots of accounts of Martin Harris saying he would put up a blanket. But mention of the blanket seems to go away after Oliver Cowdery shows up. So, or if there's a blanket, it's a blanket to separate Joseph and Oliver from being seen from other people. And as far as whether there are accounts that say that the Urim and Thummim were attached to the breastplate, but there are also accounts saying that they were detachable from the breastplate.
Right. Because isn't William Smith, is he one that talks about the Urim and Thummim being attached to the breastplate? He's one account that says that.
It is this is extraordinarily late. This is in the 1890s, just before his death, that William makes this account. And you have to remember, William was a little kid when the translation was happening. He's the youngest of the Smith children. So you wonder, how is it that he would even know?
Yeah, how reliable
to give
would
such
he be?
A detailed account.
Was he wouldn't have even been there, because it was in the Whitmer home. You said some of it was in Harmony, Pennsylvania, and then some was at the Whitmer home.
That's right. So William was not around, just like David Whitmer. when the majority of the Book of Mormon was translated in harmony. And after Joseph went to Fayette, William was still living at home with his family in Palmyra. Now they went to visit, and they may have taken William with them once. In fact, it's possible in David Whitmer's account of what we consider to be this demonstration, where Joseph used the stone in the hat to kind of give people an idea of what it was about, so they'd stop bugging him, so he and Oliver could get back to the serious work with the Urim and Thummim. I think David Whitmer says there were members of the Smith family present in his description that was published in a Chicago newspaper. So it's possible that William accompanied his parents to go visit the Whitmers, and maybe it was the occasion of their visit. I mean, according to the history, there was a relative of the Whitmers who was working in the home in a kind of domestic capacity, who got really, said there's weird things going on in this house. These two guys are upstairs all the time, all day long, and then they come down and they're all glowing and happy and spiritual. But there's something weird going on. So she threatened to quit. So that's a possible precipitating event for Joseph doing the demonstration. But it also could be the fact that maybe his parents came to visit, and they may have brought William with them, which means that he would have seen the stone in the hat demonstration. Maybe.
Well,
but the point is that he wouldn't have seen anything else.
Yeah, let me make one point about that. The William Smith account is a good example of the difference between a witness saying something happened and saying, I saw something happen. And if you read what William Smith said, he just said that this is what happened, but he never said, I actually observed this happen. Right. And that's the kind of thing that always comes out in trials and cross-examination, because people make a statement and then you say, well, were you there? And they say, well, no, but I heard, and so that's what we've tried to tease out with all of these witnesses, the difference between what they say they actually observed versus what they say happened, which is a result of hearsay or inference, assumption, and all that other stuff. And as you see, is if we get into the details of Emma and the others, that's where a lot of the difference or our skepticism about some of these statements arises, because they're not saying they saw it, and they're vague about what they did see when they do say they saw it.
We could go there next. So just to clarify, do you believe the gold plates were out in the open and that Joseph was using the Urim and Thummim with the gold plates, or was he just using the spectacles? What's your view on that?
Well, actually, hold up the cover of the book.
And
that is actually
that's your view.
That's our view right there.
That's our view of the most likely scenario. We worked very hard with our artist, who happens to be the same guy who did the illustrated book that Jonathan was showing you before, the Mauritian guy. And we worked very hard with him to come up with the best scenario based on the evidence, although, again, there's absolutely nothing that's crystal clear about these mechanics. But that,
because they don't get into the specifics about the mechanics, even as I read through the quotes, right. Joseph or Oliver, but that'll be very much in line with the traditional narrative that most of us would have grown up with, that he translated the gold plates with the Urim and Thummim. That's what we would have seen, in illustrations or videos depicting the translation. So you're very much supporting that. That was how it was translated.
Yeah. In fact, one of the things we show in that cover is Joseph actually turning the plate over, which when we went through all the existing art, nobody had ever depicted that. And so here he's engaging the plates. The other thing is there's the account of, you can kind of see it. He's holding the plate and turning it. So
turning
the Coe account.
He's actually turning the plate.
Yeah. So the Coe account has Joseph putting his finger on the characters as he's translating. And of course, Joseph Smith himself said he copied the characters and translated them. So those are the...
What account is that? The Coe account?
Coe,
yeah. Truman Coe, who was a non-Mormon who lived in Kirtland, Ohio. And he published an account in a newspaper, a non-Mormon newspaper in Ohio, describing what he says was what Joseph Smith personally told him was the process of the translation. And that account says that, well, he used the Urim and Thummim, and it would project the translation that he would then dictate to his scribe. So it's a very
but he said he put his finger on the plates on the characters.
right. And then
the Urim and Thummim would translate each character, which is consistent. Right. At that point, he wasn't copying them; he was just putting a finger on a character to translate it.
Yeah, because I believe he copied some of them when Martin Harris took some, to scholars like Charles Anton. So he copied off some of the characters
at the beginning.
Actually,
his history says that.
Let's because he copied and translated the characters as soon as he got to harmony. That was several months before Martin Harris showed up. So he wasn't doing that just for Martin Harris to take the characters.
Okay.
And that's been a little bit of a misnomer that's floated around too.
Okay, well, thanks for clarifying that. So I think we've sort of laid out your case, the statements of Joseph and Oliver, and your view that it was by means of the Urim and Thummim with the gold plate. So now let's discuss, and maybe we could talk about each one, your sort of analysis or response, because there's quite a few statements. You've got Emma, David Whitmer, Martin Harris. You've also got people like Michael Morse. You've got Elizabeth Cowdery, who I believe was she the sister of David Whitmer who married Oliver?
Yeah. Yes.
And then you've got Joseph Knight Sr. as well, who has an account. So we'll talk about maybe each one of those and get your take on it. So let's start with Emma. So you have the interview in the book of her son, Joseph III, interviewing Emma, and she talks about how Joseph would dictate hour after hour with his his face in the hat. There was no notes or manuscript, and that it was done by the gift and power of God. And she's saying that it was him using the Seer Stone in the hat. And there's also another account where she talks about it was the Urim and Thummim for the 116 pages, and then after that moved to the Seer Stone. Is Emma not a reliable witness? She was the wife of the prophet. She would have been there. I think she also says that the plates were covered up. So what's your view on that source and that statement of Emma?
Do you want to do the Pilgrim Letter, and I'll do the last testimony?
Sure, go ahead and do the last testimony first.
Good teamwork.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
We can both say the whole thing, but yeah.
And you be better than me with remembering, the exact dates and the sources and stuff. So you can help me with that.
Sure.
Yeah.
So let's take the best known one. In fact, the best known one, which is 1879. Emma Smith's last testimony is what it's called. This is presented in the format of an interview of Emma Smith by her son, Joseph Smith III, who's the president of the Reorganized Church. So this interview, it occurred in just in the weeks, literally the weeks before her death. So, and then it was published several months after her death by Joseph III. And this is an interview which is, we need to put it in its full context. It's an interview which mostly is about plural marriage. And this is the interview where there's it's a kind of Joseph Smith III was a lawyer, so we kind of relate to him and kind of see what he was doing in this thing. So he's kind of trying to duck and weave around the issue of plural marriage. But basically, this is where Emma kind of says, no, I never heard of it. Joseph didn't have any other wives but me. And these statements occur, which are really the bulk of the interview. And of course, as soon as this was published, it ignited a firestorm of protest in Utah, where there were tons of former plural wives of Joseph Smith who came right out and said, no, that's just absolutely not true. I was involved in plural marriage, and in fact, and Emma knew all about it.
Aye.
And today, even Community of Christ historians recognize that the document is not reliable on this issue, that Joseph was involved. And the interesting little detail is that Joseph Smith III himself knew this, because what had happened was when he became president of the Reorganized Church in the 1860s, he came in, guns blazing on one main issue, and that was Joseph Smith never had anything to do with plural marriage. So he presented this as a proposal at one of the earliest reorganized church conferences, that's become the official doctrine of the reorganized church. And he was voted down. And the reason he was voted down was because the older members of the church, remember, Joseph III was only 11 years old when his father was killed, but the older members of the reorganized church said to him, look, young Joseph, we support you. We did not go to Utah. We think plural marriage is terrible. But I was in Nauvoo, and I'm afraid I got to tell you, no, your father was involved in plural marriage and your mother knew about it. And it's just not true. It was a mistake, maybe. It was a wrong revelation, maybe, which is kind of the position that the reorganized church kind of has today, sort of. But it's just not, I'm sorry, it's just not true. Joseph started polygamy and Emma knew about it. And so he was, and then what they would say to him, he'd say, well, no, it's not true. No, don't tell me. I don't want to hear it. So they'd say to him, go ask your mother. Go ask your mother. Well, he didn't. He put it off and he put it off and he put it off. And then finally in 1879, he gets word that she's dying. And so finally he realizes he's got to go have this interview with his mother. So that's the setting for the last testimony. So he comes and he gets there. She's on her deathbed. He wrote a letter the day after her funeral, which we cite in the book. He wrote a letter to his uncle, William Smith, saying, we found her fast failing. So she was not in good shape. She was in very poor health when he finally got there. So, many months after her death, he publishes this interview, and it's mostly about plural marriage. And then it also has stuff about the Book of Mormon, which is clearly designed to refute the Spalding theory, because Joseph Smith III was a Book of Mormon believer and supporter. So, we give full credit for that motivation. But, this was in the heyday of the Spalding theory. So that is why he has in there statements like, could father have had a manuscript or something? He says, no, he couldn't have had a manuscript or something.
Right.
And the stone in the
Well,
hat.
Jim, the very first question was, did Sidney Rigdon marry you? So that's the very first question in the interview, which is a Spalding theory question.
Exactly. Right, so that was sort of the context around the interview.
Yeah.
Right.
That was the prominent
so
theory.
It's clearly, and I would note that in his brand new book on the Joseph Smith's gold plates, Richard Bushman also, points out that this interview has to be seen entirely in the context of the Spalding theory.
Right.
So the stone in the hat is useful in rebutting the Spalding theory because it means that it happened out in the open. So it's useful to rebut the Spalding theory. However, here's the problem. And
it also shows he couldn't have been looking at a manuscript if his face was in a hat.
Right. That's right. But we think that part is maybe credible because they're in a little log cabin. So if he'd been reading off pages and throwing them on the floor, they were in this little log cabin. It would have been very obvious that he was reading off pages from Spalding's manuscript and,
right.
Tossing.
And she says, if he had any notes or manuscript, he couldn't have concealed it from me.
Right.
Which seems reasonable.
Right. And that's reasonable. I mean, so you have to ask yourself, so she's, how much of this is Emma and how much of it is Joseph Smith III? Clearly, she was in ill health, fast failing, and yet this last testimony it's elegant, it's eloquent, it's coherent, it's comprehensive, it's complete, it's fully rounded, and it just isn't. And it's it's in language that's much more elaborate than Emma was known to use, and so and it contains all these statements on plural marriage that everybody agrees are not correct. So
And we can talk about this later, but I think also, is it in that same interview where she says that Joseph could neither write nor dictate a coherent letter, and
Yes, in that same
use,
letter.
and also critics would push back in that we have some of the early letters of Joseph and he could write, you know, a decent
Yes.
letter.
That's
So
right.
it's
He
sort of
had
like
pretty
an
decent
active
penmanship.
apologetic.
Right, exactly. So so anyway, there's all these things. We basically put forward the theory, and of course, you know, this is something that you'll never be able to tease out with precision. But I think there's a very strong reasons to believe that the last testimony of Sister Emma is primarily the work product of Joseph III. That he came there, he did have probably a nice visit with his mother, which was nice because she was dying. But how much of the words in the last testimony are Emma's, and how much are Joseph III's? I think that it just is. There's just a strong. Let's put it this way: you can't say it's absolutely conclusive, definitive, but I think that if you step back and look at it, it just comes across as being much more the work of Joseph III, who
Was it published after her death?
Oh yes,
yeah,
months after her death.
Right.
Months
okay.
after.
So there's no way we can know for 100% if it's accurate or not of what she would have said.
That's right. That's right. And there's just lots of reasons to believe that it was mostly written by Joseph III. Probably he believed. I mean, I'm not going to say probably. I'm quite certain that Joseph III, was not lying. He was not that's not a false document in the sense that Joseph III was saying things that were contrary to what he thought his mother would have said. I'm sure he sincerely believed that that's what his mother would have said if she had been coherent and able to actually talk to him. So, you need to put it in a kind of a sophisticated historical context. But now let's rush forward here to the Book of Mormon parts. So it does have the stone and hat account and so forth, which were things that they were hearing from William McClellan and David Whitmer at that time. Because this was now 1879, and William McClellan actually had died by then, but he'd been around to visit them all and had been preaching Stone in the Hat. And now David Whitmer was kind of starting to pipe up and be more heard, and he was saying Stone in the Hat. So for Joseph Smith III, who was only 11 years old and certainly wasn't even born when the Book of Mormon was translated, these were the best sources he had available. So when he had to kind of fill in his mother's interview because he got there too late, he waited too long, in our view, he used the best sources he had available, which at that time were what he had heard from William McClellan and David Whitmer. Okay, so that's 1879. This comes out. The plural marriage parts immediately are denounced by people in Utah, and even today, nobody really credits those parts at all.
Other than polygamy deniers.
Other than polygamy deniers, that's quite correct. Okay, so that's 1879. So in the 1880s, David Whitmer starts to get really active again. He starts to give lots of interviews and so forth. And now he's really putting out not only the Stone in the Hat narrative, but he's putting out that Joseph was a fallen prophet narrative in a big.
Sorry, could I ask one question before we talk about David Whitmer? Because there's another quote. Sure. I had it in a recent video, and I can't remember the statement where it was from, but she talks about how, I think it's a letter she writes to somebody, that my husband used the Urim and Thummim during the 116 pages, and then he moved to the Seer Stone. Who's that letter written
to? That's the Emma Pilgrim Letter from 1870.
Right.
We'll talk about that right after I finish on the last testimony. We're going in reverse.
Oh, you're still talking about the last testimony. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. So here's the critical thing about the last testimony. So only a few years later, in 1886, so Joseph Smith III is the president of the organized church, and he's the editor of their newspaper, which is called the Saints Herald. So in 1886, a listener, or not listener, you have listeners. In those days, people read newspapers and they had readers.
Right.
So a reader wrote a letter and he said, David Whitmer says this. He says it was the Stone in the Hat, not the Urim and Thummim. What's the story with this, President Smith? And Joseph Smith III published a lengthy lengthy front page article in the Saints Herald in which he made no reference to the last testimony, but he went back and did his own research. He went back and he dug out the Times and Seasons, he dug out the Evening Morning Star, and he discovered doing his own research that Joseph and Oliver had made these repeated statements that it was the Urim and Thummim Nephite interpreters, and made no mention of the Seer Stone. So this was and this was serious research, because remember, this wasn't clicking on his computer to go look at these files, and these weren't even indexed. So he's digging through 40, 50-year-old newspaper files to do this research. So it's a serious piece of research that he did here to come to this. But he comes to the conclusion, absolutely not, no Seer Stone. It's the Urim and Thummim Nephite interpreters.
So you're saying he had a similar Jonathon Neville experience of he accepted the Seer Stone, and then with deeper research, he was like, no, I believe Oliver and Joseph that it was the Urim and Thummim.
That's right.
That's like Drew Smith the third, Jonathan.
He was a lawyer.
That's
too,
right.
So.
He was a lawyer too. He was very thorough, and he points out that David Whitmer was not a witness of, he wasn't a scribe. He didn't, he put the case very simply. He was really a good writer. He said Oliver and Joseph the seer were the two primary participants. So why wouldn't we believe what they said? Aren't they the best witnesses? I mean, he really approached it like a lawyer. And he said, look, it's, who would believe anybody else when you got your two primary participants and two primary witnesses both saying the same thing here?
Okay, so, and a big question. So John Whitmer, he's a brother of David Whitmer, and he's one of the 8 witnesses. Wasn't he a scribe for a little bit of time?
Yes, he was.
I think it's in the book. What did he say about the translation?
He also, he was interviewed by a man named Zenas Gurley, who did a very thorough research on this subject also in the 1870s and 1880s. And he interviewed John Whitmer, and according to Gurley, John Whitmer said that it was when he was a scribe, that it was Joseph Smith using the Urim and Thummim, looking at the plates, was how he was getting it. So apparently there was no blanket with John Whitmer, because he was quite clear and definitive, saying Joseph would hold the Urim and Thummim over the plates, and that's how he'd give me the translation that I was supposed to write down.
Okay, so you would say that John Whitmer's statement in that account by, who was it? Wasn't it Zenas?
Zenas Gurley
would support Oliver and Joseph's statements.
That's right. Absolutely.
Zenas Gurley was the one who said it's clear that Joseph Smith also had a seer stone, and that he showed it to people to satisfy their awful curiosity. So he acknowledged that, which makes sense. I mean, that's consistent with what we're saying.
And is he the source you used? I'm not sure if I missed this earlier, for the demonstration, that you believe that there was some demonstration with the stone in the hat. What source do you use for that?
The main source for that is an interview of David Whitmer that appeared in the Chicago Tribune.
Okay.
It's quite a long article. It's kind of convoluted, and the guy conflates things, and it's a little confusing. None of these historical sources are perfect, but it's mainly this long article in the Chicago Tribune from an interview with David Whitmer. But what Zenas Gurley found in his researches comports with this view of what was being, how Joseph was using the Seer Stone. Gurley, after interviewing all the people, said, well, that was, he didn't show the Urim and Thummim to anybody except possibly Oliver Cowdery, but he had a peep stone, and that he showed to everybody in order to satisfy their awful curiosity. That's the phrase that Gurley uses. And so that is consistent.
The inference or implication being that he couldn't show the Urim and Thummim to other people other than Oliver. Well, I suppose if John claimed that he saw it as well, but you're saying that everyone else they weren't allowed to see.
That's right, and that's in the the Joseph Smith history in the 1838 count. He says that Moroni specifically forbade him to show the plates or the interpreters to anyone without permission.
So you would say that permission was given to Oliver, or John
Right.
Whitmer as scribes.
Right, because they were scribes, and also Oliver was authorized to try to translate. So he would
That's
have had
right.
to have used the Urim and Thummim to make his effort at translating, which is discussed in Doctrine and Covenants section 9.
Okay.
And then nobody saw them again until the three witnesses experience, which was an officially authorized, manifestation where the three witnesses were permitted and not approved to see the plates and the interpreters and the other things that the angel showed them,
Okay.
which they all testified of for the rest of their lives.
Sure. Yeah. Exactly. Okay. So I'll
So,
start interjecting
so
with
just to
questions.
quickly conclude on the last testimony, when Joseph Smith III repudiated the Seer Stone account, how could he do so since he'd published the last testimony? Again, we infer, and because he doesn't say it explicitly, we're not going to say absolutely certain, but I think it's a very reasonable inference to say his mother really didn't say those things about the Book of Mormon or the stone in the hat. He just filled them in because he was filling in all the other stuff in the last testimony because he got there too late and his mother wasn't actually in such great shape to give this interview the way it was actually published. And since he knew that his mother actually hadn't said that, it was okay. He had no compunction to then go with what his father had written. Once he did his research and found what his father had actually said, it wasn't a problem for him to then switch over and say, well, no, I'm going with what my father said in these published accounts from the 1830s and 1840s.
Okay. Right. Very good. So Jonathan, do you want to talk next about Pilgrim Letter?
Yeah, Emma Pilgrim wrote a letter to Emma Smith and asked her some questions. We don't have the letter that Emma Pilgrim wrote. We only have a copy of Emma's response. And that's the one where she said, like you indicated, that she said the first part he translated by the use of the Urim and Thummim, and after that he used the Seer Stone, which, by the way, she said it was not exactly black, but rather dark color. And here's my replica of the Seer Stone, which we all know is striped. Right,
Mm-hmm.
that's an exact size what it looks like, which doesn't look black or dark. It's striped, so it's probably not this stone anyway that she was referring to. So when we looked at that letter, it's a brief mention, and she goes on to say that she doesn't have a copy of the Times and Seasons with her, but if she did, she could go through it and explain what was correct and what was not. And it's hard to tell from that if she needed the Times and Seasons to refresh her recollection, because again, this letter was in 1870, which was, I think it was 1870.
Yeah, 1870.
Which was 40 years after the fact. And she's trying to remember, she didn't have references to refer to. And so I think she couldn't even remember who baptized her or something in this letter. So when it says that the first part was translated by the Urim and Thummim, she doesn't really say what the first part is. People infer she meant the 116 pages, but the first part could have been the whole time at Harmony, for all we know. And after that was with the Seer Stone. But again, this is another example where she doesn't say, I saw this or I did this. She just relates it as a fact without explaining that it's based on her direct observation. So it'd be like someone next door coming over today and saying, Joseph Smith translated with the Seer Stone. That person has no more direct knowledge than Emma indicated in 1870. So you can't tell.
Do you not think Emma would have seen more? Because during the 116 pages, I believe she did scribe a little bit after the last 116 pages. She would have been in the home. So someone might push back saying that although yes, this is 40 years after the fact and maybe her memory wasn't as good, that she would have been around in the house and she would have seen Joseph and the scribe doing the translation. Yeah. But what would be your response to that?
Well, I actually think Emma was the scribe for the Book of Mosiah. Mm-hmm. I've talked about that in another book.
Okay.
But the question is, when she says the first part, what was the first part? Because if the first part was while he was in Harmony, then she said he used the Urim and Thummim for the first part.
And how long was he in Harmony? Because did you say before like 75% of the Book of Mormon was done in Harmony before they moved to the Whitmer home?
Okay. They only translated, they were only in the Whitmer farm up in Fayette during the month of June. So they lived in harmony for about 2 years, or roughly 2 years. And so he did 116 pages there with Martin Harris or Emma. And then after Joseph received the plates in the Urim and Thummim back in September of 1870 or 1828, he said he began translating again with Emma. That's where I think he was doing the Book of Mosiah.
And then Oliver Cowdery showed up on the scene in April, wasn't it? April 1829.
Yeah, in April. And so the Emma Pilgrim letter hinges on what it means when she said the first part. And that's up to anybody's guess, really, because the first part could have been the whole time in harmony that he used the Urim and Thummim. But the point is that Joseph told his mother he received back the Urim and Thummim and the plates, and then Emma was translating for him or scribing for him again. So he was using the Urim and Thummim with Emma. That's what led me to think when he talks about the first part, it wasn't just 116 pages, it was the first part, which was all in harmony. And this was one of the reasons that early on, as I mentioned earlier, that I thought that based on this Emma Pilgrim letter, well, the first part was in harmony, and then when they went to Fayette, they used the Seer Stone, because that was the second part of it.
Right. So that was your inference, or how you concluded that from that statement.
That's how I rationalized it. But then when I read the letter again more carefully, I realized that Emma describes the Seer Stone in detail, but she doesn't describe her involvement at all. She just said after that he used the Seer Stone. So it could be hearsay. It could be that she was a witness to the demonstration up in Fayette, which I think is most likely, and that she based this letter on that demonstration.
Okay, so that would be your view then of Emma's statements. Why don't we talk next about Martin Harris? So Martin Harris's statements, I believe it was written secondhand by Edward Stevenson in the 1870s. Is that correct? And he's recording. Was he like in the corner of the 70 or something?
Well, at that time he was not, but at the end of his life in the 1890s, he was briefly for a few years president of the 70. But he was a very active missionary before then. Very, very active missionary before then.
Right. So maybe talk about what he records about Martin Harris and why you're skeptical of those accounts, because he was described during the 116 pages, and my recollection is he records Martin saying that Joseph used put the Seer Stone in the hat, and then he would dictate it, and then he scribed, and maybe I'm conflating, but I believe Martin also suggested that Urim and Thummim was used during the 116 pages and then moved to the Seer Stone. So maybe just talk about that as well, because that would align with what Emma said. Right.
So here again is context is important.
Very important.
So context is critical. So Martin Harris, he lived in Kirtland. After he left the church, he lived in Kirtland, and he became quite poor. And Edward Stevenson was quite a character. I'd love to meet him someday. He made a point of becoming friends with the witnesses. That just kind of was a special project for him. So when he'd go on his many missionary voyages, he went to he'd stop if he was going to the east. He'd always stop in Kirtland to say hi to Martin Harris. Now, other people visited Martin Harris too, but Edward Stevenson really made an effort to fellowship him. He kind of was his ministering, minister person. He kind of pointed himself to Martin Harris's special home teacher or minister. So eventually he was able to persuade Martin to move to Utah, where Martin had family also. And so he then, wrote to Brigham Young, and they raised money to pay for him to ride. The Continental Railroad had just been finished. It was finished in 1869, and this is now 1870. So Edward Stevenson comes to Kirtland, and he gets Martin and puts him on the railroad, and they go to Utah, where Martin lives for the rest of his life for another 5 years. He dies in 1875. And so on the trip, so there are Martin, over his lifetime, which is quite long, he gives many accounts of his experience with the Book of Mormon. And in all of those accounts, all of them, except for one, he refers to the Urim and Thummim being the instrument. And he's, uses the term spectacles, or he refers to, the Urim and Thummim that came with the plates or something like that. So it's very clear that he's referring to the Nephite interpreters. And one example of these is that literally on their train trip to Utah, they stop in Des Moines, Iowa, and Martin is interviewed by the local newspaper because, he's now Mormons are a pretty newsworthy item. And the local newspaper, he gives an account where he says the translation was done by the Urim and Thummim, that came with the plates. It's very clearly the interpreter's account, and that was published almost immediately in this local newspaper, and it's in the historical record.
Do you know what date that is roughly?
It's in the book.
It's in the book. Okay.
it's his 1870 that he's traveling to Utah. 1870.
Gotcha.
So, but it's in the book. He then comes to Utah, and of course in Utah he kind of rejoins his family. His son lives there. His brother Emer and his large family live there, and he goes and lives, and he lives for 5 more years. And lots of people come around and they want to talk to Martin Harris. He's the one of the 3 witnesses, and so there's lots of accounts of his interviews, and he always says Urim and Thummim. He says it was translated with the Urim and Thummim. His accounts are always Urim and Thummim. So he dies in 1875. And then in 6 years later, in 1881, Edward Stevenson, who, had a pretty close connection with Martin, is realizing that he needs to write down the stuff. Edward Stevenson was a diligent journalist. So he wrote very extensive journals. So he's a very valuable historical resource. His journals are all in the church history library. They've all are available online and so forth. So he decides I need to write up some of the stuff I know about Martin. So one of the things that Martin told him during their train trip to Utah was what is now famous stone swapping story.
Right. So he's the source for that.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, this is very interesting. Martin, based on the records that we have, and his life has been very thoroughly researched. Susan Easton Black and Larry Porter, I think it is, wrote an excellent biography of Martin. So the research has been done, and there is no record of the stone swapping story other than this account from Edward Stevenson. And so Edward Stevenson in 1881, he publishes some recollections of his life, of his time with Martin Harris. And he, talks about his history and the train trip to Utah and so forth, his time as being one of the 3 witnesses. And he recounts this stone swapping story, which he says Martin told them while they were on their train trip. Now, in order for the stone swapping story, that's a cool story, right? So, and Edward Stevenson, he was a bit of a raconteur, so he had an ear for a good story, and this is a good story. So he wanted to recount this story, which he apparently maybe realized he was the only one Martin ever told it to, even though Martin gave 100 interviews, was constantly being asked, and these people would write down, I went to hear Martin Harris. We have all these records of them. Never, ever, ever told the stone swapping story to anybody else. It was just, translation, Urim and Thummim, I saw the angel, it's a true, the Book of Mormon is true. That's basically what he would tell people. And so in order for the stone swapping story to make sense, Stevenson had to write that Joseph could also translate using the Seer Stone, apparently. So he has this little quick phrase that he threw into this article he wrote in 1881, 6 years after Martin's death, 11 years after Martin would have told him the story, where he says Joseph could translate it with Urim and Thummim, but he could also use the Seer Stone. And he had to do that because otherwise the stone swapping, and then he's told the stone swapping story, because otherwise the stone swapping story doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And that is the sole source, both for the stone swapping story and for Martin Harris saying anything about, or any comment on the Seer Stone being the method of translation being attributed to Martin Harris. There's absolutely no other account from Martin Harris of the numerous accounts of Martin Harris that talks about the Seer Stone. And in fact, even on the trip, so the reason I mentioned the newspaper article in Des Moines, Iowa, even on the train trip where Martin was supposedly telling Stevenson this story about the stone swapping, even on that trip, Martin's giving an interview to the newspaper saying, "Oh, it was the Urim and Thummim, that Joseph
On
had
the
to
same
that
trip.
he translated on the very same trip." And that was an article that was published contemporary. I mean, the guy ran down and printed it in his newspaper the next day.
In
So
fact,
it was fresh.
while Jim was talking, I pulled it up here, the Des Moines, Iowa paper. It might be helpful for people to know what it says.
Yeah. Do you want to read it?
Yeah, it says, Mr. Harris describes the plates as being of thin leaves of gold measuring 7 by 8 inches and weighing altogether from 40 to 60 pounds. There is also found in the chest the Urim and Thummim, by means of which the writing upon the plates was translated. By means of the Urim and Thummim, and then, quote, a pair of large spectacles, close quote, as Mr. Harris termed them, the translation was made. And Mr. Harris claims to have written of the translations as they were given by Smith, 116 pages of foolscap paper. So he explicitly described the Urim and Thummim as the spectacles that came with the plates in the box. And that was during that same trip that Jim's mentioning.
So I've heard some people interpret Martin's statements this way. And I want to get your take on this about the stone swapping. That because there's other accounts, and we'll talk about these after, but some people refer to it was the Seer Stone in the hat or the Urim and Thummim in the hat. A couple people say the Urim and Thummim was put in the hat. And some scholars have interpreted it as maybe it was Joseph Smith taking out the stones from the spectacles, and then that was what he put in the hat. So Martin isn't contradicting himself when he's talking about the Urim and Thummim, but then maybe the swapping of the stone actually happened, but it was one of the stones from the spectacles. What's your view on that?
Okay, so let's deal with that quickly. We actually have in the book 2 theories for the source of the Seer Stone accounts, because again, we're not, and I emphasize this with great emphasis, we are not saying that the people who gave Seer Stone accounts were lying.
Yes.
We're saying that they saw something and they were just reporting, but they were mixing it up with inferences, assumptions, hearsay, and so forth. That was their issue. They were not lying. They were saying something that they had a basis for saying. So,
and you believe it came from the demonstration that they probably might have saw. They assumed that's how it was always done.
That's right. But another possibility is that Joseph used the Urim and Thummim not just for translating. He also received revelations through it. And there's a number of revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants, which it says in the preface, this was received through the Urim and Thummim. So and probably the most critical is what is now Doctrine and Covenants section 17, which was the call of the 3 witnesses. That was received through the Urim and Thummim. Now, the historical accounts don't say specifically that David Whitmer or the other guys were present when that revelation was received, but it's possible. So if Joseph, now obviously, if he's going to use the Urim and Thummim to receive a revelation, that's not translation, so he doesn't need to have the plates. But he still is under orders from Moroni not to show the Urim and Thummim to other people. So in that case, if he's going to use the Urim and Thummim as a communication device, as a means to receive revelations, it would make perfect sense for him to remove one of the stones from the Urim and Thummim, since he doesn't need to have the plates and all that apparatus for the translation. And of course, because he has to hide it still, he can't show it to people. Putting it in a hat is a very logical thing to do, so it stays out of view of other people. So that's another possibility, that not to do the translation, but to receive other non-translation related revelations. Joseph may very well have taken one or more or both of the Urim and Thummim stones and put them in a hat so that people couldn't see them, because he was commanded not to let people see them. And then the Urim and Thummim would display whatever revelation it was that supposed to receive.
So you would see
that's
that after the Book of Mormon translation, but not, you wouldn't see that as during the Book of Mormon translation with the gold plates. That could have been happening. I think you talk about your view of the reconstruction of the stone swapping incident. Like, do you believe that Martin was behind the curtain so that there was a stone swapping, but you think Joseph, could tell it wasn't his stone and played along?
Right. So that's our view, and our reasoning for this is basically, so for whatever reason, I mean, Joseph had this Seer Stone with him all the time. I call it his pet rock.
Yes,
And
you referred to it that way.
lots of people in his era, in his society, had liked to have these Seer Stones, and Joseph had one, and he had it with him, and probably fiddled with it or something, like people do. And if it is the rock that's in the church history department, and Jonathan's pointed out that it's kind of maybe there's a question as to whether that's actually the Seer Stone. But if it is that stone, I mean, it's smooth and it's pretty, and I mean, I would keep it around with me if I had it. So anyway, Joseph had to have this stone, even if he had not been using it to translate. He'd had it for several years and carried it around with him, so he was very familiar with what this rock looked like. And if he was using it to translate, he'd been staring at it, for days and days and days and weeks and weeks and weeks. So the idea that Martin could find an identical stone that would fool Joseph Smith just tests common sense credibility. And on top of that, we have very recent news. We threw a footnote in the book about this because it just came up. Our friend Jerry Grover, I don't know if you've interviewed him or
I will be
seen
soon.
interviews by him. Oh, good, because he's great. He's great. So he told us that, in fact, the stone that is in the church archives that there's all these pictures of is, in fact, a very rare kind of stone. Its origins is that it's a gizzard stone from a dinosaur, and you would not find stones like that east of Wyoming, or they'd be extraordinarily rare outside of the West, because of the way the ice sheets worked and so on and so forth. So he said, I mean, not only would it be strange to think that Joseph wouldn't recognize a switched rock, but it'd be extraordinarily improbable that Martin could find a rock that looked like that rock
resembled
in
it.
Pennsylvania.
Right.
Yeah.
I think Dan Vogel would agree with you as well in his reconstruction.
It's peculiar, but when you do this exercise that Jonathan's describing, where you just kind of take the facts and then you say, okay, what are my inferences I'm taking from the facts? But let's kind of start from try to start from the same place, and then see, compare our views and so forth. And we could do that drill with the Dan, because he agrees that Joseph was not fooled.
Yes,
and then
he does.
Your inference is from that, what does that then mean? Dan would say, well, Joseph was running a con, and when he realized that Martin had pulled this trick, it was a way to run the con on Martin even more by pretending to play along with him. That would be how Dan would interpret this. But we would interpret it saying, no, Joseph was not fooled, but he saw this as being an opportunity to bolster Martin's faith, and he didn't want to. Remember, this is right. We believe, and other historians agree with us, this probably occurred right after the lost manuscript episode. So Martin's probably been pretty beaten up by being rebuked for the lost manuscript. So, Joseph doesn't want to load it on him by yelling at him about trying to pull this stupid little trick of switching the rocks. So, that'd be another reason why you kind of play along with him.
So are you
that's
skeptical of
our
that
view
account
of Joseph Smith
from Edward Stevenson then? Like, do you think Martin said something along those lines to him, or do you think? Okay.
No, we believe, I mean, Edward Stevenson's a very honorable guy. So Martin recounted this story to him, but we think it's significant that Martin never told the story to anybody else. So it clearly wasn't that important. By that point in his life, it was not that important to Martin.
There's two other things about it. Is even though we trust Edward Stevenson because he was reliable, he's repeating hearsay from years previous, which is never accurate or rarely accurate. And second, Martin
when you're
Harris
What do you mean he's
being
repeating
lying.
hearsay? Because isn't he repeating what Martin supposedly said to him, but
yeah,
he's
that's what I
just
mean.
recalling
He's
it?
repeating what Martin told him. That's
Right.
hearsay.
Right.
And then, but also Martin Harris had a long history of saying some wild things. And he, just prior to his trip to Utah, he had fallen in a field and had been unconscious and had hallucinated about lots of things.
He may have had a
So,
stroke or something.
yeah. So, I mean, we can't say whether he was relating a dream that he had or an actual experience or just his imagination. So there's all these factors that go into this story. If Martin had been repeating this story repeatedly and lots of people heard it, then it would have more credibility. And the way that it's being used today by the what I call the soothsayers is as a gospel truth. What they don't even look into the origin of it. Yeah, what the statement was everywhere, and as research became less and less credible.
Okay.
And so,
I do think it's an
now to
important
wrap this
point.
story up, let me wrap this story up.
Oh, go ahead.
Like with Joseph Smith III, we have a similar event with Edward Stevenson. So Edward Stevenson did recount this story, which whether Martin was remembering it right or not, it's, we believe that he did say something like this to Edward Stevenson, who recognized it as a fun story and republished it. And that's the source of all of the accounts that come from that. However, okay, so this is in 1881. In 1893, just before he was called to serve as a president of the 70, Edward Stevenson, who was by then an older member of the church, he joined the church in 1833, I believe, in Michigan. So he's actually British. He's originally from he's born in Gibraltar. He wrote a book of his reminiscences of Joseph Smith because he'd known Joseph Smith personally. And by 1893, there weren't so many people around who'd known Joseph Smith personally. So there was a lot of interest in, and he was a good raconteur. So he published this book called Reminiscences of Joseph Smith, and I can't remember what the name is. We call it Reminiscences. And he in the book, a lot of the book is talking about the story of the Book of Mormon because he's talking about the original foundations of the church. And he repeats the stone in the hat story. I mean, not the stone. He repeats the stone swapping story, but it's clear that mentioning that Joseph could translate using the seer stone was simply a preface to the stone swapping story. However, in this very same book, on 20 other places, when Stevenson is talking about the translation of the Book of Mormon, he says Urim and Thummim. And so, and he even has an illustration in there that people use that is shows the angel Moroni handing spectacles to Joseph Smith, and that's a not a daguerreotype, but a woodcut that he published in his book. So he goes on and on. Joseph, the Urim and Thummim is great. Joseph needed to have the Urim and Thummim, so it was in the box. It's clear that he's not confusing with the Seer Stone. And so even Edward Stevenson, kind of like I said, it was like a Joseph Smith III moment when he actually publishes his account of the Book of Mormon. He goes with the Urim and Thummim. And this is just one little kind of fun anecdote.
And you're saying he added in the statement that, he could also use the Seer Stone as well as the Urim and Thummim to make sense of that story, to harmonize?
Right. It was just a preface to make it make sense. But 20 other places in his reminiscences, he says, no, it was Urim and Thummim. It was Urim and Thummim. Joseph, used the Urim and Thummim. God gave him the Urim and Thummim. This is, part of the miracle of the Book of Mormon. And he definitely emphasized that. So people who quote Stevenson's quote of the stone swapping story as proof of the Seer Stone, somehow they don't seem to notice the fact that every place else Stevenson says Urim and Thummim.
Right.
So,
and just to clarify as well, to finish on Martin Harris, you said he gave a lot of other statements throughout his life about the Urim and Thummim, and the one about the Seer Stone is pretty much unique to Edward Stevenson. Do you know roughly how many he gave, and I assume they're probably a mixture of first and second hand. Do you know roughly how many are Urim and Thummim statements versus on Seer Stone?
In the biography of Martin Harris by Susan Easton Black and Larry Porter, there's about 70 pages where they recount interviews of people. And in Dan Vogel's early Mormon documents, the Martin Harris is about 130 pages of accounts. And, it's all Urim and Thummim, except for this one account,
right?
Secondhand account. It's all, he always refers to it being Urim and Thummim. So I don't have I haven't counted up totals, but I'm pretty good. I'm pretty sure I'm right on the page lengths that in the Black and Easton biography is about 70 pages of just recounting interviews in Utah that Martin gave. And like I said, the Dan Vogel's collection it's like I think 130 pages of all sorts of different Martin Harris.
There'll be at least a few, probably dozen statements in there then, at least maybe.
Oh yes. Oh yes. Oh yes. Oh yes.
Well, that's important to take that into account, all those statements as well. Okay.
Right.
So then what about David Whitmer? And he's probably one of the main witnesses cited to support the Seer Stone in the hat. I think he's famous for the quote where he says that Joseph would put his head in the hat and then, to block out the light, and then the spiritual light would shine from the stone, and then he would read the words, a character, and then the translation. And that's how the Book of Mormon was translated. And he again talks about how it was 116 pages, and then it was with the Urim and Thummim, and then after that it was the Seer Stone, which you sort of addressed. So maybe talk about David Whitmer and why you don't think he's super reliable. I think you've touched on him as well, but
right.
Well,
so just briefly, you want to?
Yeah, we don't want to belabor this too long because we've already been going a long time and you have more questions. But essentially with David Whitmer, we see him as having observed this demonstration that we've talked about, and everything else is extrapolation from that, because he even admitted he wasn't around for most of the translation, that Joseph and Oliver worked long hours upstairs. He wasn't present for any of that. And so by the time
he was never in harmony.
Yeah, he was never in harmony. And when he said that Joseph never got the Urim and Thummim back after it was lost, that directly contradicts what Joseph Smith himself said, as well as Lucy Mack Smith and Oliver Cowdery. And he wouldn't know anyway, because he never saw the Urim and Thummim until he was one of the three witnesses. The other thing that's a critical point we made earlier is, even in his witness to all, or his statement to all believers in Christ, he starts off by refuting the Spalding theory again before he gets into the stone in the hat explanation. And to us, it looks like a pure apologetic, because he was in a dilemma, because the Spalding theory, in fact, the book Mormonism Unveiled was talking about what was Joseph doing behind the veil or the curtain. That was the whole point of the book. And so in order to refute that, he and others had to say there was no veil. Joseph did it out in the open. And again, relying on demonstration. Yeah. So we look at David Whitmer as trying to refute the Spalding theory, relying on his own experience of the demonstration, and then kind of elaborating or extrapolating on that based on what he'd heard from other people, because he just wasn't a witness. He wasn't a scribe.
Okay. So a few other statements. You've got Michael Morse, who I believe is he a brother-in-law of Emma Smith? He has an account where he claims that he witnessed the translation and he would support Joseph Smith putting the Seer Stone in the hat. I don't know if you addressed that statement in the book. I'm not sure what date that is. I have it on the slide, but I think I just got it from Book of Mormon Central, so I don't know the exact date. But you have him, like Elizabeth Cowdery, Joseph Knight Sr. talks about him putting the Urim and Thummim in the hat. So he uses the word Urim and Thummim, but it's similar to the David Whitmer, saying that then he would see the translation. But again, those three statements of Michael Morse, Elizabeth Cowdery, Joseph Knight Sr., as well with Emma, Martin, and David, talk about him putting either the Seer Stone or the Urim and Thummim inside the hat. Any thoughts on those statements?
Yeah, on the Elizabeth Whitmer or the Elizabeth Cowdery one, that's based on a deposition that she allegedly gave, but the only copy we have is the one that William McClellan made. The original disappeared. So he claimed that he copied her deposition, but he was a real advocate for the stone in the hat also. And
Okay.
so you have to say, well, did he copy it accurately? I mean, again, you don't have an actual authentic statement from her. You only have what McClellan said she said.
Okay.
So it's hearsay there. It's the other two, Morse, I don't remember when the date of his either, but it was
Yeah,
after. It
I can
wasn't
see if I can try to find out. Anyway, keep going. I can read
Yeah.
his statement. He just says the mode of procedure consisted in Joseph placing the seer stone in the hat, putting his face in the hat, to cover his face, resting his elbows upon his knees, dictating while the scribe or some other wrote it down. So that'll be consistent with the Sith accounts.
Yeah, it is. And it's consistent. You could argue it's consistent with them as last testimony.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember when he gave it.
No, I don't know.
Again, it's hard to say whether he was repeating what he'd heard. I know he said he saw it, I think, as I recall.
Yeah, I think it says it in the statement.
But it's all these things are. It's frustrating to us as looking.
Yeah,
at
because he says I had occasion more than once to go into Joseph Smith's immediate presence and saw him engaged at his work of translation. So yeah, he's saying that he witnessed the translation.
But he doesn't say when or where or what Joseph dictated. And those are pretty significant problems with those statements.
Well, would you say that's unreliable though, if he didn't say like, oh, what specific day or what portion, but like,
yeah,
that still undermine his testimony?
Yeah, well, because of this problem with the demonstration idea, because we don't know who was present. If he was present at the demonstration, for example, then okay, we agree with that. Everybody who was there would say that Joseph used the stone in the hat, obviously, and the same with the third one you mentioned,
Joseph Knight.
Joseph Knight Senior.
Yeah, he may have been present at the demonstration, or he was just relying on hearsay.
So of the two, Elizabeth Whitmer Cowdery was only a teenager at the time that the translation was taking place. She very likely would have been at the house when the demonstration happened. And Joseph Knight Sr. was a Whitmer neighbor. So it's also probable that he came over and saw the demonstration too, because he was a neighbor and, very interested in the work and what was going on. And especially just to put together what I was saying earlier, if the Smiths were in town, then that'd be even more occasion for Joseph Knight to have come over and also then be witness to the demonstration, along with Elizabeth, who lived there. And so, of course, if they did the demonstration, Joseph did the demonstration with the Whitmer family, Elizabeth was part of the Whitmer family, and that's why she would have seen that. But the important point is none of these people were scribes. None of them were, they this Michael Morse is a little vague, many times, how many times, how often really.
Well, a question I was about to ask you is about, you saying that he would have done a demonstration for people visiting. Was that like a one-time thing, or would there have been like multiple demonstrations?
It's hard to say. I mean, in the Chicago Tribune account, it seems to only refer to this as a one-time event, but it's entirely possible that Joseph did it more than once for different people. But at least the big event that we think occurred in the Whitmer home, it seems from the Chicago Tribune article that it was a one-time event.
Okay.
Well, the other thing is that we mentioned earlier that Joseph may have used one of the stones from the Urim and Thummim to receive revelations by looking in the hat. And it's easy for people to conflate him dictating a revelation versus doing a translation as well.
Okay.
So the bottom line here, though, Steve, is that Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery were explicit in published statements that they used the Urim and Thummim that came with the plates to translate the plates. And in the Doctrine and Covenants, the Lord told them to translate the engravings on the plates. And so, you have those specific, clear, declaratory statements that are official statements, juxtaposed with all these ancillary, mostly hearsay statements of dubious reliability. And so how do you reconcile the two? And the way that the scholars are doing now, well, here's an example. So in the Gospel Topics essay, they studiously avoid ever quoting what Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery said, apart from the gift and power of God, which is an extract, a truncated quotation. But they don't ever quote what they actually said. Instead, they quote Emma and David and the others. And so it's like they're deliberately avoiding this cognitive dissonance that arises if you compare what Joseph and Oliver actually officially said versus what everybody else said. So we look at that. The Stoddard's approach is to say everybody else was lying. Our approach is to say, no, they were telling the truth, but what did they actually say? And what did they actually observe? And what was hearsay or inference, and so on. And we feel we've gone through all the accounts, and we feel pretty confident that it's easy to see how Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery and John Whitmer told the actual account, well, and Martin Harris for that matter. They all told what actually happened, where Joseph transferred the divine with Urim and Thummim. Everybody else demonstration on hearsay. And then it's easy to reconcile. And the reason it makes a big difference is now some of even the LDS scholars are saying that Joseph and Oliver deliberately misled everybody when they talked about the Urim and Thummim, because obviously Joseph Smith used the Seer Stone instead, didn't even refer to the plates.
Well, I wanted to ask you a question about that. So maybe we could wrap up on, maybe we can make this part 1 and take a wee break, and then do a part 2 focusing more on the nature of the translation. I had a couple more questions. One is the Jonathon Hadley quote, and that was a contemporary account in the newspaper, and he's saying that he was told this by Joseph Smith. I believe it's when they're looking to go print the Book of Mormon, and I discussed this with Stephen Smoot, and he thinks there's some credibility to it because he describes the dimensions of the plates very accurately, and then he also describes that Joseph would put the spectacles in the hat and then dictate it, which would sort of support the statements from some of the other witnesses about, the Seer Stone in the hat. And he says that this account seems to support that whether or not it was the Urim and Thummim or the spectacles, or it was the Seer Stone, it's supporting that method of him putting the instrument in the hat. What do you make of that account? Do you not see it as maybe that could be reliable? It's contemporary. Yes, it's not coming from Joseph, but it seems to be quite accurate of, what might have been happening.
Yeah, the early accounts from 1829 that Jim mentioned earlier in the Palmyra newspaper, I think the Rochester newspaper, said he put spectacles in the hat. But right there, you have to say Joseph was forbidden to show anybody the spectacles. So that could not have been a direct observation. It had to be an inference or an assumption. Because if someone sat there and said, yeah, I saw him put spectacles in the hat, then they saw the Urim and Thummim, which violates the whole premise that we're talking about, that Joseph had been forbidden to show those. So either he put a stone in the hat, or they heard that he had put the spectacles in the hat, but no one observed him put the actual Urim and Thummim in the hat. So that's one of the inherent problems with those statements.
But with Jonathon Hadley, he's not claiming to have been a witness. He's claiming, he's writing down what he supposedly heard Joseph tell him was the way he translated it. So do you not think, if that's what Joseph Smith supposedly told him, and if he's accurate about these other details, would he not, be reliable? Maybe this is actually the way Joseph was doing it?
Well, again, a lot of people were describing the plates. I mean, it's a problem because it's still hearsay when it's a newspaper account. And even David Whitmer made a point that he did an interview with I don't remember which newspaper it was, and afterwards he wrote a letter to the editor and said, this guy promised me he would say everything exactly, and instead look at all the things he said that were wrong. And anybody who's been interviewed by a newspaper knows that happens, because in modern times we record interviews, but back in the day they would take notes and they would conflate what they heard with other things that they heard. And so it's possible that Hadley was accurate, but there's no way of knowing, and it is a hearsay account. But the key thing is it contradicts what Joseph Smith actually expressly published.
Right.
So, you know, if you
Well, he does
if
talk
someone
about the spectacles in the hat because Joe Smith refers to the Urim and Thummim, but he doesn't always refer to. Did I put the Urim and Thummim in the hat, or did I use the gold plates?
Right.
He just refers to the Urim and Thummim. So someone might say that it's his account may not necessarily be contradictory to what Joseph or Oliver claimed.
Well, and I
No.
even proposed it in my book, A Man That Can Translate. As part of this demonstration, people said Joseph put the spectacles, let's say, or the stone in the hat, and he dictated words. No one wrote down what he actually dictated on those occasions. So there's no direct chain of, or a causal chain, or I'm sorry, chain of evidence between what Joseph dictated during the demonstration and the text we have today. Like no one said, David Whitmer didn't say, I was there and he dictated the first chapter of Alma, or, you know, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no direct link. Joseph could have been saying anything just to show that that was how the process was. Then I proposed that if what Joseph dictated during this demonstration was actually in the Book of Mormon today, I think it was the Isaiah chapters in 2nd Nephite that he recited from memory. And that's a whole nother argument, but that's how I see one way to reconcile all these accounts.
Okay, so I've got one or two last questions. Oh, sorry. Do you
just if I could quickly mention about the hat, our friends over in the Stoddard camp have also speculated that the hat might have been a big hat, and lots of people think it may have been a big hat, and they some of them have speculated that the hat was used to cover up the plates, because remember, I mean, if Joseph was in a setting where he couldn't readily isolate himself, they've speculated, and they have illustrations, they've done drawings to show how this might have worked, and so they've said that he might have used the, you know, he get the hat, and then it cut the bottom out of it, he'd cover up the plates with that, because the plates are not that big, you know, 6 inches by, you know, 7 inches, that's not that big, and then he'd put the Urim and Thummim into the hat as well, so that it was on top of, so you could be using it to scan over the plates, but the hat was around the whole apparatus, so to speak, to block the view of other people. Now,
that'll be a pretty big hat.
I'm not sure I buy that, but it's a different, you know, it's another approach, and you know, because we're multiple working hypotheses, so you know, we want to acknowledge our colleagues, our friends over there at the Joseph Smith Foundation have come up with that as another alternative working hypothesis.
I don't know what I make of that, him having a super large hat. You know, is there any evidence for that? Okay, well, one final question or two on this, because some might say that you're privileging Oliver and Joseph's statements over some of these other witnesses. Now, I think you make. I appreciate that you've done a lot more research than me on this, and that you're remembering the sources and you're giving a lot of good context. So I think your arguments need to be taken seriously. Someone might argue, though, that, for example, in Section 8 of the Doctrine and Covenants, it talks about Oliver Cowdery having the gift of Aaron. And me growing up, I was like, what the heck is the gift of Aaron? I read it as a missionary, and I was like, is he like a spokesperson? And then the Lord's like, but you held it in your hand and it's told you many things. I'm like, I have no idea what this is. And in the Book of Commandments in 1833, it's referred to as the gift of the rod. And one could maybe conclude from this, is this a shift away from, a dowsing rod, which is maybe kind of magical, to making it sound more biblical or religious? And someone could make the same argument. Could Joseph Smith or Oliver in the history be just wanting to refer to the Urim and Thummim or the Nephite interpreters because that sounds more religious, that sounds more biblical than him using a seer stone, which he used in folk magic, or treasure digging? And if there's evidence of him de-emphasizing maybe magical elements of the history, like with Section 8 of the Doctrine and Covenants, what if they're doing it here? What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, okay, let's talk about the sprout. It was actually originally the gift of working with the sprout, and then they changed it to the rod and then the gift of Aaron.
Okay.
So by the sprout, he meant a dowsing rod, presumably,
Hmm.
right?
Which was used for
Which
like
dowsing,
water witching and I think
yeah,
finding minerals and treasure.
which I have background in because I learned how to use dowsing rods when I was at BYU, from one of my professors who did it
Really?
professionally. Yeah, he did it professionally to find water, and he was able to tell you how far down the water is, whether it was an underground stream, and how fast it was flowing, all kinds of details.
Wow.
And then I used it myself. I used rods myself to find water when I worked for a landscaping company, because we'd go to a project and there'd be underground sprinklers everywhere, but you don't know where they are and you don't want to dig up the whole yard. So you use the rods to go find the water, and you can tell exactly where the lines are going. So it's just a tool that people use.
Hmm.
So, some people today think, the skeptics will say, well, there's no scientific basis for it. And I say, that's fine, but I use them. So, and they always work.
Well, I remember
So,
I did an interview, not to go off track, but with Dan Peterson, and he talked
yeah,
about using a dowsing rod once, and he said it worked, and
yeah.
he was very surprised by that. I've never used one,
Yeah.
so I don't know.
Well, I've tried it with a lot of people, and for about half the people it works and half it doesn't. And it has nothing to do with belief either, because some people who are skeptics, it works and they're surprised, like Dan. Other people who really believe, it just doesn't work. So it's a biogeochemical something
Hmm.
process. But you ought to try it sometime. Just get some welding rods and or some old hangers if they're made out of metal. It's a fun thing to do. But anyway, so whether they changed it because they wanted to hide the magical worldview, as some say, or they changed it to make it a more general application, because the gift of Aaron is, you could argue, is what Aaron did with physical objects, right? So God would use physical objects to perform miracles or to reveal knowledge. And so by originally, when it said the gift of using the sprout, that's just only one specific gift, let's say. But by saying the gift of Aaron, that's a broader term. It's not hiding the original, because it was published. Everybody can read it in the Book of Commandments,
Hmm.
but it's making it of a more general application. That's how
Right.
I would say. And then as far as adding the phrase by the means of the Urim and Thummim to section 10, I think that's the other one I don't know if you mentioned that, but
No, I didn't actually,
originally,
but
yeah, the original version of section 10 only said he had the gift to translate. And then in 1835, when they published the Doctrine and Covenants, they added the phrase, the gift to translate by means of the Urim and Thummim. So critics say, again, this is kind of getting away from the stone in the hat, hiding the stone in the hat. The other interpretation that I adopted is they're clarifying, because at the time of the original revelation, everybody knew he was using the Urim and Thummim. But in the interim, the Mormonism Unveiled had been published in 1834. And that's the one where they bifurcated the narrative to say, some people say it was a stone in the hat, other people say it was a Urim and Thummim. So to clarify that, Joseph and Oliver, and maybe Sidney Rigdon, inserted that phrase by means of the Urim and Thummim in the Doctrine and Covenants in 1835, so there would be no ambiguity or no possibility that he was using this stone in the hat. So
and would you
I
say
think,
Mormonism Unveiled, writing about both the Seer Stone in the hat and the Urim and Thummim, and you would say that they're hearing hearsay or rumors about it. There's no attributed sources, but
right,
you say that they must be getting those rumors from somewhere about the Seer Stone in the hat. But
yeah.
your reconstruction would be that there was some sort of demonstration with the Seer Stone in the hat, and that might have been where it came from.
Yeah, that was the basis for the rumors.
Right. Okay.
And so because Mormonism Unveiled presented on the same page, it presents those as two alternative explanations. Right after that, Oliver Cowdery wrote that it was by the Urim and Thummim. But then when they published the Doctrine and Covenants the year afterwards in 1835, they specified it was the Urim and Thummim again. And I think that was a response to the confusion that Mormonism Unveiled had generated.
Okay. Right. Final question or two on this.
Well, can I make a quick point about the other issue you raised, which is Joseph and Oliver's possible motivation for adopting the term Urim and Thummim, that they were
Yeah.
trying to hide the folk
And
magic.
to clarify, I'm not saying necessarily lying, because you could view it as some people would view it as both instruments were used, so they're not lying by saying it was by means of the Urim and Thummim, maybe it wasn't just one or the other.
Right. Well, so here's the quick analysis. Forget about religion. Let's just say it's some other historical issue. What did some regiment do during a particular war, or why was a particular political decision taken, in Parliament or whatever? Just some other historical issue that's in some dispute. And you have on the one hand two eyewitnesses who were participants in the action, and they give consistent accounts in writing, close in time to the events, and they repeat those statements consistently several times, close in time to the time that the events happened. And then you have other witnesses who were not present for the actual event, who in most cases, decades later, come out and say, no, I don't. I think those two guys are wrong. I think it happened this way. If you're just looking at it, we leave the religious aspect of it aside. It's just trying to decide something happened. What happened in the Crimean War, or with this regiment, or whatever. Just something. You can't. Nobody's going to say the two eyewitnesses who wrote written, published, contemporary accounts close in time to the event are the definitive answer, because it could be that they were lying.
Sure.
But if you're weighing your evidence, who are you going to give more evidence to? If the two eyewitnesses close in time, contemporaneous, or the people that give testimony who weren't actually present at the scene, who gave testimony decades later. I mean, it's just, so when you say we privilege Joseph and Oliver, well, with good reason, because they were the two primary eyewitnesses. Joseph Smith III makes this point in his essay as well. Who are we going to believe? These people who weren't there, or the people who were there? Now, so the issue then becomes, because historians recognize this analysis. Dan Vogel would recognize this analysis, and the people who promote the Stone Hat account, they recognize this as an issue. So the question is then, we were talking before, so you have the facts, and then people start to add their assumptions and their inferences to build their theory. So the idea that Joseph and Oliver started to switch over to talking about the Urim and Thummim because they were kind of embarrassed about the whole, treasure digging background, and trying to shift attention to the treasure digging background. Believe me, Jonathon and I have researched this thoroughly, and it would be great if we've never been able to come up with a specific statement from Joseph or Oliver specifically and explicitly denouncing the Seer Stone. Now that would, if we found that would have helped us, but it also would support this idea that Joseph and Oliver were embarrassed about the treasure digging background and the Seer Stone. But there is simply no evidence that we can find that would indicate that Joseph and Oliver or any of the other early saints were particularly embarrassed about the Seer Stone. In fact, the advocates of the Seer Stone, in the Hat account, historians, LDS historians who advocate this, they often make a big point about how Seer Stones were really popular, and everybody loved Seer Stones, and everybody had a Seer Stone, and Seer Stones were very acceptable, and so forth. So this notion that Joseph and Oliver switched over to calling it Urim and Thummim and tried to hide, the fact that there was a Seer Stone someplace, it just doesn't have any historical. It just doesn't comport with the historical record. But it's a good theory. So it's a good illustration of the fact that you can take all the facts, but then people add their inferences and assumptions. Today, we're embarrassed by the Seer Stone. So we're reading back into the 1830s, this embarrassment, and saying that must be what has motivated Joseph and Oliver to kind of move away from it. But they're really just is no evidence that we can find that indicate that they denounced it as not being true because they said it was the Nephite interpreters that we used, but they or any of the other people never say. In fact, people like David Whitmer were big Seer Stone fans. His objection was that Joseph didn't use the Seer
They
Stone
stopped.
enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, they stopped using the Seer Stone. So it's it's a theory that has some traction. I know this is certainly something Dan Vogel would advocate, was that they were embarrassed in trying to hide the folk magic background of the operation.
Because I
But
think he would
we
also
just
argue that Joseph de-emphasized maybe to the extent of how much treasure digging he was engaged with in his own history, working for Josiah Stoll, and then with, Doctrine and Covenants section 8. So you're saying that's a plausible theory, but you would say you're inferring or you're interpreting that there's nothing that explicitly shows that's what they were doing.
Right. And you kind of have to make a distinction. Yes, I would not argue against the idea that Joseph kind of downplayed his money digging past. That's probably true, but that's a different matter than using the Seer Stone for the translation. They're kind of separate pieces, because as I said, there's lots of sources amongst the early saints that seem to indicate that they were fine with the Seer Stones. It's just that's not what was used to do the translation. So I think there needs to be, we kind of need to recognize that when people make this argument that they were using the Urim and Thummim to kind of hide this whole folk magic background, it doesn't really comport with I really don't know of any real explicit historical evidence to back that up. And so I kind of thinking this is more a matter of us reading our modern day embarrassment about it back into the culture of the 1830s that the early saints lived in.
Okay. And what would you say, because I did an interview with, I don't know if you know who Michelle Stone is, but she has a
Yes.
YouTube channel, and I think she's advocating more that Joseph Smith wasn't a polygamist, and I don't agree with her, but I had a civil discussion with her, and I was like, let's dialogue, and you share your reasons why. And they would say, Emma denied Joseph was a polygamist. Joseph denied that he was a polygamist. I suppose you could say carefully worded denials. I believe Hiram denied it as well, and there's lots of denials that they were polygamists. And then other than, maybe John C. Bennett or like the Laws and Aviu Expositor, contemporary accounts, a lot of the accounts for Joseph Smith being a polygamist are like later accounts by, some of the wives and other church leaders who claim like, oh yes, he taught polygamy. And someone could say like, are you not doing the same argument where you're not trusting all of these later accounts from these witnesses, you're privileging Joseph and Oliver's account, but then shouldn't it apply the same then to polygamy? You should privilege Joseph and Emma, that he wasn't a polygamist then, and ignore all these later secondhand or later recollections. What would you respond to that? Like, is it not the same?
Well, I don't see it. Well, I don't know what you would say, Jim. We haven't talked about this, so I don't know what Jim would say, but I would say you do have section 132 in the Doctrine and Covenants.
Well, they would say forged by Brigham Young in
they say
put in what 1876. That's what she would say, because William Clayton, he claimed to write it in his journal, or yes, he was the one that recorded it, wasn't he?
Yeah.
But they would say, oh, you can't trust William Clayton. So I don't side with their reasoning, but I'm pretty much saying that someone could their reasoning and say, are you doing the same thing?
That's right. You can rationalize anything and find evidence to support it. I think Joseph F. Smith said it was a private revelation and that never should have been published because it was not intended to be published. So he kind of contradicted Brigham Young's approach to it, although he didn't take it out when he was president of the church. So there's, you can go down that rabbit hole too. But I think that one of the differences is that Joseph Smith didn't make a big point about it, about denying it in a published account like he did in the Elders Journal or in the Wentworth Letter with the translation. And it was left a little vague, and that's why it's problematic, and people can find evidence to support whatever they want. but I don't think it's really comparable to the Stone in the Hat issue or the Hill Cumorah for that matter, because the people who were involved with the polygamy directly gave their own personal experiences with it. It wasn't relying on hearsay like most of the Sith accounts. It was people. Eliza Snow said, "I was standing next to Emma when this all happened." You know, those kind of things. So they're not just relating what they think they heard, or what they assume happened. They're saying, "I was there. This is when it happened. This is what happened." Very specific.
Yeah, I would agree. That was sort of the point I was going to make, is that there really is a clear distinction between the late translation witnesses and the late polygamy witnesses, because the late polygamy witnesses are still firsthand witnesses. They are participants. Whereas, with the possible exception of, Emma, the late translation witnesses are all hearsay secondhand witnesses. None of them were scribes. None of them can specifically say that they were present to see anything other than possibly our demonstration. And so that's a big difference between those two sets of witnesses. And then for me personally, on the plural marriage issue, enormously, when I discovered this, I was just flabbergasted. But I find a very convincing piece of evidence, and I don't know that Michelle has ever dealt with this or addressed this, because it's not well known, because you have to like dig into reorganized church history, which we were researching for our book, but not too many people especially in the LDS church really pay much attention to Community of Christ history. But this account of the 1865 organized church conference, where Joseph Smith III specifically put forward a proposition that this should be an article of faith, that Joseph never had anything to do with polygamy, and it was voted down because all the older members who had been in Nauvoo, who were anti-polygamists because they were in the reorganized movement, nonetheless stated to Joseph III, "I'm sorry, but I was there, and your father was the one who introduced polygamy. So,
Wow.
we can't have this as an article of faith." For me, that's a pretty convincing event. And it's just obscure. I don't know. I mean, it's in our LDS church histories. I mean, it's not something they hide, but it's just kind of obscure. And I only stumbled across it in doing research for this book. And I don't know that the thing has been well publicized. But for me, that's a very convincing piece of history on that issue.
What something I actually thought was quite a good smoking gun, in my view, for Joseph practicing polygamy was looking at the statements of the laws in the Nauvoo Expositor, and how it actually, I thought, aligned very well with things in D&C 132. Even if you view them as apostates, I thought it was quite strong evidence that they probably had read the revelation, they weren't making it up, and that did originate with Joe Smith. Okay, very last question, then we're going to stop. Why not just say, like, faithful historians or scholars, that it's not an either or? It wasn't just the Urim and Thummim or the Seer Stone. Why not both, to harmonize all of these statements? And it's not always crystal clear if he was using the Seer Stone or if he was using the Urim and Thummim, and both are sort of seer devices, part of the translation. Like, why not say, hey, maybe it was both? Like, why are you advocating that it had to be just the Urim and Thummim?
Well, my response to that, Jim might have a different one, is that I would be fine with doing that if they actually put out the actual things that Joseph and Oliver said. But the Gospel Topics essays just doesn't even quote them, so they don't deal with the problem. And nor does the even the book McKay Dirtmat book, they omit stuff that contradicts their theory. And so I feel like it's important to put all the evidence out there and then let people draw inferences.
I agree. That's probably actually criticism to myself, because I did a recent video on the witnesses of the translation. I knew we were going to have a discussion. So I think I had one quote from Oliver Cartier about the Urim and Thummim, but I didn't show all of their statements. And you're right. If you're going to be transparent, you should let out all the data and not leave out any that would go against your theory. or your
Yeah.
view.
And by the way, we may not have had the Hadley statement in our book, but it is in my other book, The Man That Can Translate. Like Jim said, we condensed a lot of the material, so we didn't put everything in this latest book.
Yeah. And actually,
So
one thing I want to say this now, that one thing I respect about you and reading your book, because I did enjoy reading it, I respect the fact that you at least deal with these sources. You know, you, whether or not you're right or wrong, you at least try to give a analysis and a response to it. You don't try to dodge them, because other people who had, you know, denied the Seer Stone, whenever I asked them questions, they were just like, oh, well, David Whitmer was an apostate, and he was a fallen prophet, and Martin Harris was a loony by the end, and Emma Smith, she lied about polygamy. And I feel like you're giving a better sort of explanation, you know, for their statements. You're not just dismissing them.
But I think it's fair that, you know, for some people, it doesn't matter. They say, this is one of the responses I get most often. What difference does it make? The Book of Mormon is true regardless of how Joseph produced it. And that's a legitimate approach. It's on the same side, other people say, well, it's false no matter how he produced it. So we have that dichotomy, right? But for us, and maybe this will get more into the next time when we talk about the actual method of the translation, that's where it becomes more significant. Because if he was just reading words off a stone, to me, that's not, it doesn't make sense of why he would edit it later, for example, why he would say, why he would feel entitled to make changes to this text that supposedly came, you know, miraculously on a stone.
Right.
For me personally, since I grew up in a mixed faith life, you know, most of my life, the idea of words of and he read is if it presented the Book of Mormon to me that way instead of as a translation of an ancient manuscript, I never would have believed it. And I have, that's why I'm frequently, I mean, this last week it's come up again. I'm frequently asked by people, why is my nephew or why are my kids leaving the church? And I say, well, do they tell you? And usually they start with The Stone in the Hat or the Book of Abraham, one of those two. And they don't even understand why it's an issue, because they've never read the CES letter. They don't listen to Mormon stories, you know, and so they have no clue. And when I say, well, have you read the Gospel Topics essay? Most of them haven't even read that. And I hesitate to even encourage them to do that, because then it raises the same questions. And to me, the Gospel Topics essay is counterproductive, just because it's deceptive in the sense that it doesn't give people what Joseph and Oliver actually said about it. It's a very agenda-driven document. And most of this material put out by Book of Mormon Central is the same way. They just don't want people to know that there's this conflict that generates cognitive dissonance. And so the way we resolved it, as we've talked about for the last time here on the interview, we think reconciles all the evidence. And it's plausible, it's consistent with human nature that we've had over decades of experience as lawyers dealing with witnesses and how they can reconstruct memories and all that kind of stuff. So I'm comfortable with it, looking at it as objectively as I can. And so
do you think that your book, your theory best accounts for all of the statements?
Yeah.
You know, dealing with, you know, all the statements of David Whitmer, Emma, you know, Martin Harris, but then also Oliver Cowdery, Joseph Smith on the translation. Also, a lot of the statements you said of Martin Harris and John Whitmer, you feel like you try to include all of them. Why do you think that faithful scholars or faithful historians then, what would be your view on why you think they're trying to de-emphasize Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery's statements then?
I think my own view after talking with a lot of them is it's cognitive dissonance. They can't reconcile it. And so they, rather than try to reconcile it, they avoid the topic by just omitting what Joseph and Oliver said. I mean, how can you imagine, how could anybody do an essay on Book of Mormon translation and not include what Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery actually said about it? And yet that's what the Gospel Topics essay is. It's based on it's whoever wrote it. You can speculate about who wrote it, but whoever wrote it was promoting their agenda rather than providing legitimate, substantiated references for members of the church to access. And so I've been critical of it for a long time, you know. But it's anyway. So I just feel like the scholars the church historian's office owes it to the members of the church to explain what Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery said. And if they want to try to rationalize it away, that's fine. But members of the church should know that that's what they're doing.
Right. So even if they still promote that it was both the Urim and Thummim and the Seer Stone, you just want them to show what Joseph and Oliver have to say about it as well. And then people can come to their own conclusion on it, harmonize it as they will. Either line with your theory that I think was just the Urim and Thummim, and maybe all the Seer Stone, Seer Stone in the Had accounts was, a demonstration they saw or hearsay, or if they want to believe it's both. Your point is you would want people to see all of the statements and not omit some. Well, I think that's fair enough. And actually, I can't disagree with that. That's what I'm all about. Like,
I know you are, and yet they do. The historians disagree with us about this. That's why it's not in the Gospel Topics essay. It's amazing to me. But
another factor to kind of explain it on a different level. I mean, so the short answer is the reason we emphasize the Urim and Thummim is because Joseph and Oliver emphasized the Urim and Thummim, and they're the two primary witnesses and should be privileged, and not, certainly, if not privileged, at least they should be disclosed.
Right.
But I think there's another phenomena going on here, which is that, academics have groupthink also. And what happened is, just looking at the history of the rise of the Seer Stone and the Had account, it really began in the 1980s. It got a big push, obviously, with Mike Quinn's Mormonism Magic Worldview book. And then some other people started to write some articles. And what happens in academia is that nobody has the time to become the total expert on everything. You can't research every single subject in depth. So what people in academia do is they say, well, Joe and Fred have written an article on this, and looks like it's got a lot of footnotes and looks like they really researched this well. So I'm not going to focus on this because Joe and Fred already took care of it. And I'm instead going to go over here and focus on this other subject that hasn't been researched before and that I want to write about. But, I know Joe and Fred, they're part of the club. And so, I'll kind of go with what they have to say. So that's what's happened with the Seer Stone and the Hat. When we, Jonathon can probably talk to these people more than I have. When we talk to these folks, there's very few of them who've actually done in-depth, back to the sources, how reliable are these sources, research on any of these sources. But there have been a couple of people who've written articles, and then another person just kind of, and then it's kind of it's like a snowball. They keep citing each other, and they assume, well, in Fred and Joe, actually, it's two guys who wrote an article in Dialogue in 1982 that kind of really started it. I can't remember their names right off the top of my head, but they've already done this one, so I'm kind of going to go with them because everybody else seems to agree with them. So, and I don't want to be out, I don't want to be outs with the club. Everybody else in the club seems to have accepted this research that these relatively small number of people did on this subject. So we're going to go with that because I don't really want to have to go back and research that issue.
Yeah, you kind of go with the scholarly consensus, and I would have to admit that I was the same way. I just would have accepted this. The church has acknowledged it in the Gospel Topics essays. Most faithful or non-faithful historians say that this was the mode of translation. I had read through some of the sources, and I just would have accepted that. And whether or not you're right or you're wrong about the method of translation, I think it's important. One, that I think there's a discussion to be had. You're presenting counter evidence. You're promoting Joseph and Oliver's statements and saying, hey, these need to at least be taken into account. Don't just ignore all these statements if you're going to be transparent and then, interpret or conclude how you wish. But would you would see it not compatible being both, other than the demonstration explaining, but you wouldn't see it as him sometimes using the spectacles, sometimes using the Seer Stone throughout the translation? Would you see them as contradictory? It couldn't have been both?
it comes
Well,
back to
I would
this.
say,
That's what Joseph and Oliver said. They only mentioned the spectacles, the Urim and Thummim.
well, for me,
You
it
know,
goes beyond that though, because the Urim and Thummim was specifically designed for the translation.
Hmm.
And so, in my view, the whole narrative collapses if you say, well, he could just use a seer stone, because then Moroni's instructions about how they were preserved with the plates so that he could translate. There's no reason for any of that. I'm sure you've seen the meme that has Joseph looking in a hat and it says, you know, the prophets recorded all this history and abridged it and preserved the plates and everything just so Joseph could look
And
at a stone and eye, right?
yeah, and the plates were never used, and that's a big reason why a lot of people, lose faith is the Seer
Totally.
Stone in the hat account. 'Cause they're like, what was the purpose of the
Yeah.
plates? And they have a lot of
Right.
issues with that this is a different narrative than, there's a lot of deception and all by the church
Right.
as well. They
Yeah.
covered up this history, and does it call into question
Yeah.
this being an authentic translation? And there's different ways you could still view that, maybe it was the meaning of the plates rendered to his mind, and people have different theories of was he seeing words through the stone or not. But no, I get
so if
I
I
get
could,
why you would interpret it that way. That
Yeah.
it would seem that the gold plates weren't as meaningful or significant then in the translation if it was just the stone in the hat.
Yeah, I know
yeah,
recently Evidence Central published a little article about all the reasons that the plates are important besides since they weren't used in the translation. And you read through their reasons and it's just transparent bias confirmation. It doesn't make any sense. And so and I think a lot of the work of the apologists has led people to question their faith because you just can't read it and think this is rational, because they're saying Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery misled everybody, but that's okay because the plates were close enough that they somehow spiritually fed the stone. It just collapses as a narrative. And
so
I
if I
think
could,
it's
if I could
oh, go ahead, Jim.
actually
Yeah.
jump in here and read to you from, this is the last page of Richard Bushman's new book on the Joseph Smith's gold plates.
Which, by
So
the way,
this
I
is
think
how
Stephen
Richard,
Pinecker said to me that he references you quite a bit in his new book, Richard Bushman, which, well, if Richard Bushman kind of takes
yes,
you seriously, then maybe we should, at least take you guys a little bit more seriously in what you're saying.
yeah, there's lots of references to Jonathan's work in here. But this is what Richard says at the end of his book. The quotes, let's see. Among Latter-day Saints, the question is, why the plates at all? As long as it was believed Joseph read from the plates through the Urim and Thummim, their purpose was clear. But if he read the text from a seer stone while the plates lay covered on a table, as many now believe, what part did they play? Why the effort to preserve them throughout the centuries? Why the trouble to recover and protect them? Why their presence? Sometimes it looks as if the plates were both essential to translation and useless, if you take that theory. So that's how Richard Bookman concludes his book.
Well, guys, Jonathan,
With that
Jim,
question, it's a very, I mean, it really goes to the heart of it.
yeah. Well, guys, I think this has been a really good, enjoyable episode. I think we've gotten a little bit more into the weeds in this episode, which is kind of what I wanted, but I thought it was quite a good, thorough discussion, and at least you sharing your view and your take, your analysis of the translation, Urim and Thummim versus Seer Stone. We're thinking of doing a part 2 and talking about their view of the nature of the translation, being maybe more of a functional translation, explanations for the King James Bible and 19th century sounding phrases, Andrew Smith being sort of like an active participant in the translation rather than him reading sort of a supernatural, already translated by God translation. Right. So we're going to do that maybe in part 2 and ask any other questions we didn't cover in part 1. But again, I'll just promote your book by means of the Urim and Thummim. I would recommend reading it because it's definitely, I think, an important book in this conversation on Book of Mormon translation. So thank you guys so much for coming on and having this interview. I feel like I could talk to you forever. And it's funny, I was saying at the start of this interview, I felt really sick and I was feeling really low. But as the interview was going, kind of like I powered through it, and I'm like, this is so fun, so interesting that I don't even Didn't even remember that I'm not feeling well.
Well, I'm glad. I'm glad you're feeling better. It's been
Yes,
enjoyable.
yes.
You asked good questions. I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you. Thank you, guys. And listeners, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, like, share, and subscribe. Go check out their book. And maybe I'll leave in the description if you would be happy if people had any questions for you, maybe an email or some way to contact you. I'll get that after.
Yeah, sure.
If you have any questions as well, and just check out their work and scholarship. And if there's any faithful scholars who are watching who are outraged by what they've said, you're welcome to come on and respond to their arguments. I'm welcome to hearing people who want to respond as well. But thanks so much, guys. Take care.
Okay.
Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.